Welcome to Wisdom. Relax, close your eyes. You can drift off. Let the story carry you to sleep.
Our story begins in the final, turbulent decades of the Roman Republic, with the birth of a child who would one day reshape the entire Mediterranean world and leave his mark on all of human history. On the 23rd of September, in the year 63 BC, a boy named Gaius Octavius was born in the ancient city of Rome. His family was respectable, but not particularly distinguished. They belonged to the equestrian class, that comfortable middle tier of Roman society, situated between the common people and the great senatorial families who had dominated Roman politics for centuries. No one watching the infant in his cradle could have guessed that this child would become the most powerful man the world had ever known. His father was a minor official, his mother connected to the family of Julius Caesar, but only distantly. It was a modest beginning for a man who would eventually be worshipped as a god throughout the vast territories of Rome's dominion. The young Octavius grew up during a time of profound instability and uncertainty. The Roman Republic, which had endured for nearly 5 centuries, was tearing itself apart. Generals marched their armies against one another. Politicians were murdered in the streets. The old certainties of Roman life were crumbling, and ambitious men saw opportunities in the chaos. Among them was Julius Caesar, the brilliant general who was conquering Gaul and amassing wealth and power that made the Senate tremble. Caesar noticed his young relative Octavius. He saw something in the boy, some quality of intelligence or determination that set him apart. And so, when Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC, the world discovered that he had named Octavius as his adopted son and heir in his will. The 18-year-old boy suddenly found himself at the center of Roman politics, with enemies on every side and an inheritance that many powerful men wished to claim for themselves. What followed was years of civil war, alliance, and betrayal. Octavius proved himself far more cunning and ruthless than anyone had expected. He formed the Second Triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus, and together they hunted down Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, defeating them at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. But the triumvirate could not last. 3 ambitious men cannot share power indefinitely. Lepidus was gradually pushed aside, and the Roman world divided between Octavius in the west and Antony in the east. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavius's fleet destroyed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled to Egypt, where they took their own lives rather than face capture. Octavius stood alone as master of the Roman world. He was 32 years old, and the long centuries of republican government had finally come to an end. In 27 BC, the Senate gathered and granted him the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, the illustrious one. It was a name heavy with religious significance, suggesting something more than human. From this moment, we may speak of him as Augustus, the first Roman emperor, though he was careful never to use that word himself. His reign would last for over 4 decades, from 27 BC until his death in AD 14, a span of 41 years that transformed every aspect of Roman life. He called himself merely the first citizen, the princeps, and insisted that he had restored the republic. But everyone understood the reality beneath the careful language and ancient ceremonies. Power now flowed from one man alone, and that man was Augustus. His achievement was nothing less than the creation of a new form of government. The Principate, as historians call it, preserved the outward forms of the republic while concentrating real authority in the hands of the emperor. The Senate still met. Magistrates were still elected. The courts still functioned. But behind this republican facade, Augustus controlled the armies, the treasury, and the most important provinces. He had learned from his adoptive father's fate. Julius Caesar had been murdered because he seemed too much like a king. Augustus would be more subtle. He would rule absolutely while appearing to defer to tradition. It was a delicate balance, maintained through a combination of genuine political skill and carefully cultivated image. Augustus reformed nearly every aspect of Roman administration. He created a standing professional army, ending the dangerous practice of generals raising personal armies that owed loyalty only to their commander. These legions were stationed on the frontiers, far from Rome, where they could defend the empire without threatening the capital. He established the Praetorian Guard, an elite force stationed near Rome itself, theoretically to protect the emperor but destined to play a fateful role in the reigns to come. He organized police forces and fire brigades for the city, services that the chaotic republic had never properly provided. He reformed taxation, making it more systematic and less arbitrary. The provinces, long exploited by corrupt governors, received more consistent and honest administration. The physical transformation of Rome was equally dramatic. Augustus famously boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was no empty claim. Temples rose across the city, their columns gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun. Forums and basilicas provided spaces for commerce and law. Aqueducts carried fresh water to fountains throughout the city. Roads radiated outward from Rome to every corner of the empire, well-maintained highways that facilitated trade, communication, and the rapid movement of armies wherever they might be needed. Augustus understood that architecture was a form of propaganda, a silent argument for the legitimacy of his rule. Every building proclaimed the power and permanence of his regime. Every temple reminded Romans that the gods favored their ruler. Yet for all his public success, Augustus struggled with the most personal of matters. He championed traditional Roman morality, passing laws that encouraged marriage among the upper classes and penalized adultery with exile or worse. He presented himself as a defender of old Roman virtues against the decadence of the age. But his own family proved impossible to control. His daughter Julia, his only biological child, became a source of profound embarrassment. Her affairs were public knowledge, a scandal that mocked everything her father claimed to represent. In 2 BC, Augustus was forced to banish her to a barren island, where she would spend the rest of her life in exile. He never spoke of her again. The man who could command legions and bend the Senate to his will could not command his own daughter. It was a painful irony that Augustus would carry to his grave. Augustus could also be ruthless when he perceived threats to his power or his position. In his younger years, during the proscriptions that followed the formation of the triumvirate, he had allowed or ordered the deaths of hundreds of Roman citizens whose only crime was their wealth or their suspected disloyalty. Even in his later years, when his position was secure, he showed little mercy to those who plotted against him or proved disloyal. Freedmen who betrayed his trust were executed. Senators who spoke too freely or too boldly found themselves in danger. The peace of Augustus rested, in part, on fear. Romans understood that their benevolent ruler could become something else entirely if provoked. The question of succession haunted his entire reign. Augustus had no sons of his own, and Roman tradition offered no clear mechanism for transferring power. He pinned his hopes first on his nephew Marcellus, who died young. Then on his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, whom he adopted as his own sons, but they too died before reaching maturity. His grandson Agrippa Postumus proved unstable and was eventually banished. One by one, Augustus buried the young men he had groomed to succeed him, watching his careful plans crumble with each funeral. In the end, he was left with Tiberius, his stepson, a capable but gloomy and melancholy man whom Augustus had never particularly liked or trusted. Yet there was no other choice. Tiberius was adopted as Augustus's son and designated as his heir, ensuring that power would pass smoothly when the time came. Augustus died on the 19th of August in the year AD 14, at the town of Nola in southern Italy. He was 75 years old, ancient by the standards of his time. By remarkable coincidence, he died in the same house where his father had died decades before. The Romans, always attentive to omens and patterns, would not have missed the symmetry. His final illness was mercifully brief, and the ancient sources generally agree that he died of natural causes, simply wearing out after a long and demanding life of constant labor. Yet rumors persisted that his wife Livia had poisoned him, perhaps to ensure Tiberius's succession before Augustus could change his mind. Some whispered that she had coated fresh figs with poison while they still hung on the tree, knowing her husband would pick them himself. Whether true or not, the story reflects the atmosphere of suspicion that surrounded the imperial court. In a world where power was absolute, every death invited speculation. Augustus was promptly deified by the Senate, becoming a god to be worshipped alongside Jupiter and Mars. The era he had created would endure for centuries to come. The empire he had built would shape the entire world long after the last emperor had finally fallen. The man who inherited Augustus's carefully constructed empire was a very different sort of ruler altogether. Tiberius Claudius Nero was born on the 16th of November, in the year 42 BC, into one of Rome's oldest and most distinguished patrician families. The Claudii had been prominent in Roman affairs for centuries, producing consuls, generals, and statesmen whose names echoed through the annals of the Republic. They were known for their pride, their stubbornness, and their fierce dedication to what they believed was right. Tiberius carried the weight of that heritage in his bearing, in his aristocratic pride, and in his deep sense of duty to the state. He was not born to be emperor. That role had been thrust upon him by tragic circumstance, by the untimely deaths of younger men, and by the cold political calculations of Augustus. He accepted it, as he accepted everything, with a grim determination that left little room for joy. His early life had been marked by upheaval and displacement. As a small child, he had fled with his parents through the chaos of civil war, narrowly escaping death on multiple occasions. His mother Livia divorced his father to marry the powerful Octavian, the future Augustus, when Tiberius was only 3 years old. The boy was raised in the household of the man who would become emperor, always aware that he was not truly part of that family, always conscious of his ambiguous position. He grew into a tall, strong young man with a reserved manner, a deep intelligence, and a remarkable talent for military command. Augustus sent him to the frontiers of the empire, where he proved himself an excellent general, winning important victories in the Alps, along the Danube, and in the dark forests of Germany where Roman legions had met disaster. He secured the northern borders of the empire through years of patient, methodical campaigning, earning the respect of his soldiers if not their love. When Augustus died in AD 14, Tiberius became emperor at the age of 55. The Senate confirmed his authority, and no serious rival challenged his position. He was, after all, Augustus's adopted son and designated heir, a proven military commander with decades of experience. Yet from the very beginning, his relationship with the Senate was uneasy. Tiberius seemed to want the senators to share in governing, to take responsibility and show initiative. But decades of Augustus's rule had trained them to defer to the emperor in all things. They waited for instructions and guidance that Tiberius was reluctant to give, for he genuinely wished them to govern alongside him. He grew frustrated with what he saw as their craven servility and lack of initiative. They grew confused by what they perceived as his obscure intentions. It was a poison dynamic that would haunt his entire reign. In the early years, Tiberius governed competently and even admirably. He maintained Augustus's administrative framework, avoiding reckless changes or unnecessary innovations. He was fiscally responsible, keeping taxation moderate, and building up reserves in the treasury. He avoided military adventures, focusing instead on consolidating the conquests already made. The frontiers remained secure. The provinces were governed with reasonable honesty. By any objective measure, the empire functioned well under his careful administration. Yet Tiberius never won the affection of the Roman people or the loyalty that Augustus had commanded. He lacked Augustus's gift for public relations, his ability to seem approachable and benevolent even while wielding absolute power over millions of lives. Tiberius was too proud, too reserved, too obviously contemptuous of the masses and their entertainments to ever be loved. The great shadow over his reign was Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was ruthlessly ambitious, deeply cunning, and utterly without scruple or moral restraint. He consolidated the scattered cohorts of the Guard into a single fortified camp near Rome, concentrating dangerous military power in his own hands and making himself the gatekeeper to the emperor. He cultivated Tiberius's trust, making himself indispensable to the aging emperor. Gradually, he built a network of informers and allies throughout the government. When Tiberius's son Drusus died in AD 23, many suspected poison, and later evidence suggested that Sejanus had indeed arranged the murder, seducing Drusus's wife Livilla to help him. With Drusus dead, Sejanus moved to eliminate other potential rivals, using accusations of treason to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The treason trials that followed cast a pall of fear over Roman society. Senators denounced one another. Informers grew rich on confiscated estates. The atmosphere in Rome became poisonous with suspicion and betrayal. In AD 26, Tiberius made a fateful decision that would define the latter half of his troubled reign. He left Rome and withdrew to the island of Capri, a rugged and beautiful place off the coast near Naples. He would never return to the capital city he had come to despise. From his cliff-top villa, perched high above the sparkling waters of the bay, he continued to govern the empire through letters and messengers, but his physical absence from Rome allowed Sejanus's power to grow dangerously unchecked. Ancient sources paint a lurid picture of Tiberius's life on Capri, describing grotesque sexual depravities and cruel entertainments. How much of this is true, we cannot know. The accounts were written by authors hostile to Tiberius, eager to portray him as a monster. What seems certain is that his isolation bred paranoia. Cut off from direct contact with the Senate and the people, he relied increasingly on reports from Sejanus and other informers. Trust became impossible. Every friendship seemed potentially treacherous. The treason trials multiplied during these dark years, creating an atmosphere of terror among the Roman elite that none would soon forget. The ancient law of Maiestas, originally intended to protect the dignity and majesty of the Roman state, was twisted into a deadly weapon against anyone who might be suspected of disloyalty to the emperor. A careless word, a dream reported by a slave, an ambiguous gesture could lead to prosecution, exile, or death. Properties were confiscated. Families were destroyed. Some of the accusations were surely justified, for there were genuine plots against Tiberius. But many were clearly motivated by personal grudges, political rivalries, or simple greed for the estates of the condemned. Tiberius seemed unable or unwilling to restrain the process. Perhaps he believed the accusations. Perhaps he no longer cared. The reign that had begun with such careful administrative competence was now ending in blood and fear. Tiberius's relationships within his own family were constant sources of grief, suspicion, and bitter disappointment. His nephew Germanicus, a popular and charismatic general beloved by the armies and the common people alike, had died under mysterious circumstances in AD 19, possibly poisoned by agents unknown. Tiberius had never been close to Germanicus, and rumors spread that the emperor himself had ordered the murder, though this seems unlikely. Germanicus's widow Agrippina became Tiberius's bitter enemy, convinced that he had killed her husband. Her sons, potential heirs to the throne, were caught up in the factional struggles around Sejanus. 2 of them would die in prison or exile. Only the youngest, Gaius, survived, protected perhaps by his youth and apparent insignificance. He would later become emperor himself, remembered by history as Caligula. Finally, in AD 31, Tiberius turned against Sejanus with devastating swiftness. Perhaps he received convincing evidence of the prefect's long-planned treachery from an unexpected source. Perhaps he simply recognized how dangerous his once-trusted minister had become. In a carefully orchestrated political maneuver worthy of Augustus himself, Tiberius had a lengthy letter read to the Senate that denounced Sejanus and ordered his immediate arrest. The man who had terrorized Rome for years was seized, condemned, and executed on the same day. His body was torn apart by the mob. His children were killed, his statues pulled down, his memory damned. But the destruction of Sejanus did not end the reign of terror. If anything, the treason trials intensified as Tiberius sought to root out all of Sejanus's former allies and associates. The final years of the reign were the darkest of all. Tiberius died on the 16th of March, AD 37, at the coastal town of Misenum on the Bay of Naples. He was 77 years old and had ruled the Roman Empire for 23 years. The ancient accounts of his death are confused and deeply contradictory. Some say he died of natural causes, his aged and weary body simply giving out after a brief illness. Others claim that he was smothered with a pillow by the Praetorian prefect Macro, who was eager to install the young Gaius as emperor. Still others suggest that Gaius himself participated in the murder. What is certain is that Rome greeted the news of his death with undisguised joy and relief. Crowds gathered in the streets of the capital, celebrating wildly and shouting for his body to be thrown into the Tiber. The Senate refused to deify him. His long reign, which had preserved peace and prosperity throughout the vast empire, was remembered only for its cruelty, suspicion, and the terror of the treason trials. Tiberius had never wanted to be emperor, and in the end, the crushing burden of that unwanted power had consumed him entirely. He left behind an empire that was stable, solvent, and at peace with its neighbors, but also a dark legacy of fear and mistrust that would shape the reigns of emperors to come. The young man who now became emperor was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus on the 31st of August, in the year AD 12, into the most exalted family in the Roman world. He was the son of Germanicus, that beloved general whose mysterious death in the distant east had cast such a long and terrible shadow over Tiberius's reign, and of Agrippina the elder, the fierce and ambitious granddaughter of Augustus himself. Royal blood flowed through his veins from multiple directions. From his earliest days, young Gaius was raised among soldiers in the rugged camps along Rome's northern frontiers. His father took him to the military camps on the Rhine, where the legions stood guard against the Germanic tribes, and where the little boy toddled about in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny military boots. The soldiers adored him and gave him the affectionate nickname Caligula, meaning little boot or little soldier's sandal. It was a name that would follow him into history, though as emperor he is said to have despised it, as he much preferred the dignity of his formal titles to any reminders of his childhood among common soldiers in muddy camps. His early years were marked by unimaginable tragedy and constant danger. He watched helplessly as his family was systematically destroyed by the machinations of Sejanus and the dark suspicions of the aging Tiberius. His mother Agrippina, that proud and fierce woman who had never hidden her contempt for Tiberius, was arrested and exiled to a barren island called Pandateria, where she eventually starved herself to death in grief and defiance. His older brothers Nero and Drusus were likewise condemned on charges of treason and killed. Of all the many children of the beloved Germanicus, only young Caligula and his 3 sisters survived, and their survival seemed to depend entirely on seeming harmless, even completely insignificant to all who held power. The young Gaius was eventually summoned to live with Tiberius on the island of Capri, where he spent years in the company of the paranoid old emperor. What he saw there, what he learned about power and cruelty and how to survive, shaped him in ways that would become all too clear once he held power in his own hands. When Tiberius died in March of AD 37, the Roman world greeted the accession of Caligula with genuine enthusiasm and tremendous hope for the future. He was the son of the beloved Germanicus, the last surviving male heir of the popular branch of the imperial family that the people had adored. He was young, only 24 years old, reportedly handsome with a pleasant manner, and apparently well-disposed toward both the Senate and the common people. The first months of his reign seemed to confirm these optimistic hopes magnificently. He granted generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the legions stationed on the frontiers, securing their loyalty with lavish payments. He staged costly public games and spectacles that delighted the Roman populace, who had been starved for such entertainment under Tiberius. He recalled exiles, burned the records of the treason trials, and seemed determined to govern in a spirit of openness and reconciliation. After the dark final years of Tiberius, the new emperor appeared like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. The reign of Caligula lasted just under 4 years, from March of AD 37 to January of AD 41, a brief span that would become one of the most controversial and hotly debated periods in all of Roman history. The ancient sources portray him as a monster of cruelty and madness, a tyrant who did unspeakable crimes and gave in to the most depraved acts. Modern historians have questioned some of these lurid accounts, noting that they were written by authors hostile to his memory and eager to justify his eventual assassination. Yet even allowing for exaggeration and propaganda, there is no denying that something went wrong with his rule. The hopeful young prince of the early months became something far more dangerous. Some ancient sources report that Caligula fell seriously and dangerously ill a few months into his reign, hovering near death while Rome held its breath. When he finally recovered, according to these accounts, his personality had changed dramatically and irreversibly. Whether this represents some genuine medical or psychological crisis, perhaps a brain fever that hurt his mind, or just a handy tale to explain his later acts, we do not know for sure. What is clear is that his relationship with the Roman Senate deteriorated rapidly and dramatically. He seemed to delight in publicly humiliating senators, forcing them into degrading public roles that mocked their ancient dignity and made them look ridiculous before the crowds. He demanded to be treated not merely as emperor, but as a living god walking among mortals, insisting on divine honors that shocked traditional Romans who remembered Augustus. He reportedly planned to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul, though whether this was serious intent or deliberate mockery of the Senate remains debated by scholars to this day. His financial management was absolutely catastrophic for the Roman state. Caligula spent lavishly and recklessly on games, spectacles, extravagant banquets, and ambitious building projects, rapidly depleting the enormous treasury that Tiberius had so carefully and painstakingly accumulated over decades of frugal management. When the money inevitably ran short, he turned to extortion, confiscation, and even forced auctions where wealthy Romans were compelled to purchase items at absurdly inflated prices. He accused citizens of imaginary treasons and seized their estates for the treasury. He imposed new taxes that fell heavily on ordinary people. The generosity of his first months gave way to a desperate scrambling for funds that alienated every class of Roman society. The accusations of depravity that fill the ancient sources are extremely difficult to evaluate with any objectivity. Writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing long after his death, describe incestuous relationships with his sisters, sexual humiliation of nobles and their wives, sadistic cruelty that seemed to delight in the suffering of others, and bizarre public behavior that shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy. How much of this is true? How much is exaggeration for rhetorical effect? And how much is outright invention by hostile sources with political motivations? We cannot determine with certainty today. What seems clear is that Caligula violated norms of acceptable behavior in ways that shocked his contemporaries. He blurred the boundaries between emperor and god, between public dignity and private indulgence, between legitimate authority and naked tyranny. Even if the most extreme stories are discounted, he clearly created an atmosphere of fear and unpredictability at court. The famous story of Caligula ordering his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war illustrates the difficulty of interpreting his reign. Some historians today see this as clear evidence of madness. Others suggest it was a deliberate humiliation of troops he considered unreliable. Still others propose that it was a misunderstood military exercise, or even a later invention. The truth is now beyond recovery. But the story's long persistence speaks to how the Romans of later ages remembered him, as a ruler whose acts defied all rational thought, whose whims could transform military campaigns into absurd theatrical performances. By AD 41, resentment against Caligula had reached a dangerous and explosive level throughout the Roman ruling class. Senators who had been publicly humiliated and stripped of their dignity, military officers who had been threatened or arbitrarily demoted, and courtiers who lived in daily fear for their lives began to whisper and conspire. The plot that emerged centered on a few key officers of the Praetorian Guard itself, the very soldiers who had been so richly paid at the start of his reign and who now found themselves forced to see and take part in his wild excesses. On the 24th of January, AD 41, as Caligula was walking through a narrow underground corridor in the palace complex after attending the morning games, the conspirators struck with sudden violence. They surrounded him and stabbed him repeatedly, killing him in a wild frenzy of blades and blood. He was 28 years old and had ruled for less than 4 turbulent years. The assassination did not end there, for the conspirators were thorough in their bloody work. The conspirators also murdered Caligula's wife Caesonia, who was stabbed to death, and their infant daughter Julia Drusilla, smashing the baby's head against a wall to ensure no heir survived who might become a rallying point for loyalists seeking revenge. The brutality was deliberate. They wanted to end not just Caligula's life but his entire line, to make clear that there would be no restoration, no revenge. The Senate briefly entertained hopes of restoring the Republic, but those hopes were quickly dashed. While senators debated, the Praetorian Guard found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified for his life. The soldiers proclaimed him emperor on the spot, recognizing instinctively that their privileges, their wages, and their very power depended on having an emperor to serve and protect. And so the Julio-Claudian dynasty continued despite everything, passing from the murdered tyrant to an unlikely successor, whom absolutely no one had ever considered a serious candidate for imperial power. Caligula's reign had lasted less than 4 years, but its terrible memory would haunt Rome for many centuries, a warning about what happened when absolute power fell into the wrong hands and when madness sat upon the throne of the world. The man whom the soldiers had found trembling behind a palace curtain was perhaps the most unlikely emperor Rome would ever know in all its long centuries of imperial rule. Tiberius Claudius Drusus was born on the 1st of August, in the year 10 BC, in the city of Lugdunum in the province of Gaul, making him the first Roman emperor to be born outside the Italian peninsula itself. His father was Drusus, the younger brother of Tiberius and a brilliant military general who had died tragically young while campaigning in Germany. His mother was Antonia Minor, the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, a woman of formidable character and unimpeachable virtue. He was connected by blood to both Augustus and to Antony, the rivals of Actium, carrying within his veins the mingled heritage of the civil wars that had created the empire. From his earliest years, Claudius was considered an embarrassment to his illustrious and accomplished family. He suffered from physical ailments that made him seem weak and foolish in the eyes of his proud relatives who valued strength and dignity above all else. He walked with a pronounced limp that made every step awkward. His head shook involuntarily, especially when he was nervous or excited. He stammered badly when he spoke, struggling to form words that came easily to others. His own mother reportedly called him a monster whom nature had begun but never finished. Augustus, his great-uncle, treated him with a mixture of bewildered concern and condescending dismissal, never considering him a serious candidate for any public role. Tiberius ignored him almost entirely. Caligula found him useful as a figure of fun, someone to mock at dinner parties and humiliate for the amusement of guests. Throughout the reigns of 3 emperors, Claudius lived in the shadows, dismissed as an idiot, excluded from power, and thereby, perhaps, saved from the deadly intrigues that destroyed so many of his relatives. What his family completely failed to recognize was that behind the awkward and embarrassing exterior lived a keen, curious, and surprisingly capable mind. Claudius spent his long years of exclusion from public life studying, reading, and writing. He became a genuine and accomplished scholar of Roman history, Etruscan antiquities, and the finer points of the Latin language and its grammar. He composed extensive historical works that, though now sadly lost to us, were respected and consulted by later generations of Roman scholars. His long isolation from politics gave him time to observe how government actually functioned, to understand the machinery of empire without being caught up in its dangers. When the Praetorian Guard suddenly thrust power into his hands, he proved far more capable than anyone had expected. The stammering fool turned out to be an effective administrator. Claudius became emperor on the 24th of January, AD 41, immediately after the assassination of Caligula. He was 50 years old, and he had spent half a century being dismissed and overlooked. The Senate, which had briefly dreamed of restoring republican government, was forced to accept the choice that the soldiers had made. They had little alternative. The Praetorians controlled Rome, and they wanted an emperor from the imperial family, someone who would preserve their privileges and pay their wages. Claudius rewarded them with a generous donative, establishing a precedent that would bind emperors and their guards together in mutual dependence for centuries to come. His reign lasted 13 years, from AD 41 to AD 54, and it was marked by substantial accomplishments that belie the ancient caricature of him as a weak and foolish ruler. The most dramatic achievement of his entire reign was the conquest of Britain. In AD 43, Claudius sent 4 legions across the stormy channel to invade the mysterious island that the great Julius Caesar had raided a century before, but had never truly subdued or brought into the Roman fold. The invasion was remarkably successful. Claudius himself traveled all the way to Britain to witness the capture of Camulodunum, the great stronghold of the native kings, and to receive the formal submission of numerous tribal leaders who bent the knee to Roman power. He spent only 16 days on the island, but it was enough to claim a triumph, to add new territory to the empire, and to show at last that the stammering scholar could be a conquering emperor. Beyond Britain, Claudius proved himself a capable administrator who took his duties seriously. He extended Roman citizenship to provinces and communities across the empire, recognizing that Rome's strength lay in incorporating conquered peoples rather than merely exploiting them. He improved the legal system, sitting as judge himself for long hours and showing particular concern for the rights of slaves and freedmen. He invested in infrastructure, building new aqueducts to supply Rome with fresh water, constructing a new harbor at Ostia to facilitate the grain ships that fed the capital, and improving roads throughout Italy and the provinces. These were unglamorous achievements, the quiet and patient work of good government, but they strengthened the empire in lasting and meaningful ways. Yet Claudius's reign was also marked by features that his critics seized upon as evidence of weakness and poor judgment. He relied heavily on freedmen, former slaves who had been given their liberty and who now served in his administration. Men like Narcissus and Pallas accumulated enormous power and wealth, controlling access to the emperor and influencing policy in ways that offended the traditional senatorial aristocracy. To the old elite, it seemed degrading that former slaves should wield such authority, that the business of empire should pass through their hands rather than through the proper channels of senatorial consultation. Claudius either could not or would not restrain them, and their influence contributed to the perception that he was not truly in control of his own government. His private life was a constant source of scandal and, ultimately, profound tragedy. Claudius was married 4 times over the course of his life, and his marriages brought him little happiness and much public humiliation. His third wife, Valeria Messalina, became utterly notorious for her alleged affairs and her ruthless political scheming at court. The ancient sources describe her as a woman of insatiable appetites and shameless behavior who betrayed her husband repeatedly, and even staged a shocking public marriage ceremony with one of her young lovers, Gaius Silius, while Claudius was away from Rome on imperial business. When the scandal finally reached the emperor, Messalina was executed, leaving Claudius a widower with young children and a reputation as a cuckold who had been the last to know of his own disgrace. His fourth and final marriage proved even more fateful for the future of the dynasty. He married his own niece Agrippina the Younger, the sister of the murdered Caligula and the mother of a son from a previous marriage, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who would later be known to history as Nero. Agrippina was ambitious, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in advancing her son's interests above all other considerations. She persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero as his own son and designated heir, thereby pushing aside Britannicus, the emperor's own biological son by the executed Messalina. She accumulated power and influence at court, carefully maneuvering her loyal supporters into key positions throughout the government and preparing the way for Nero's eventual succession to the throne. Ancient sources suggest that when Claudius began to waver, to reconsider the arrangement and favor Britannicus once more, Agrippina acted decisively to protect her investment. Claudius died on the 13th of October, AD 54, at the age of 63 years. The official announcement proclaimed that he had been taken suddenly ill after eating a dish of mushrooms, his favorite delicacy. But rumors immediately spread throughout Rome that Agrippina had poisoned him to secure the throne for her son before the old emperor could change his mind about the succession. Some accounts claim that she employed a professional poisoner to coat the mushrooms he loved. Others say that when the first dose failed to work quickly enough, a physician named Xenophon finished the job by administering poison on a feather, supposedly to help Claudius vomit. Whether true or not, these stories reflect the deep suspicion that surrounded deaths in the imperial family, where natural causes were never quite believable and every passing was examined for evidence of murder. The Senate officially deified Claudius after his death, enrolling him among the gods of Rome and declaring that divine honors should be paid to him throughout the empire. It was a recognition that, despite his physical infirmities and awkward manner, despite his scandalous wives, and despite his heavy reliance on freedmen, he had governed the vast empire competently and responsibly for 13 years. He had conquered Britain and added it to Rome's dominions. He had extended citizenship to communities across the provinces. The stammering fool whom his own proud family had despised and dismissed for decades had proven himself entirely capable of ruling the greatest power the world had ever known. Yet his own legacy was in fact very complicated by what came after. The son he had adopted, the boy Agrippina had placed in line for the throne, would become the Emperor Nero, and Nero's dark reign would end the Julio-Claudian dynasty in fire and blood. Claudius had preserved the empire and significantly extended its boundaries, but he had also, perhaps quite unwittingly, set the stage for the reign of its most notorious and destructive ruler. The young man who now ascended to the throne of the Roman world was just 16 years old, a boy raised entirely in the shadow of his ruthless and deeply ambitious mother. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, as he was now formally known following his adoption by Claudius, had been born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on the 15th of December, AD 37, in the pleasant seaside town of Antium south of Rome. His father was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man of notoriously cruel and dissolute character, who reportedly said that any child born of himself and Agrippina could only be a disaster for Rome. That father died when Nero was only 3 years old. His mother was Agrippina the Younger, the surviving sister of the murdered Caligula, and one of the most formidable women in all of Roman history. From his earliest years, Nero's life had been shaped by his mother's consuming ambition to see her son rule the world, and now, with the death of Claudius, that ambition had been realized at last. The early years of Nero's reign were surprisingly successful and well-regarded. He was guided by 2 exceptional advisors who worked together to keep his worst impulses carefully in check. The first was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the famous Stoic philosopher and prolific writer who had been recalled from exile on the island of Corsica to serve as Nero's tutor, and who now became his principal advisor on all matters of state and policy. The second was Sextus Afranius Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, a blunt and honest soldier who provided military expertise and a steadying influence at court. Together, Seneca and Burrus managed the young emperor, steering him toward moderate policies and keeping him occupied with harmless pleasures while they attended to the serious business of governing. The first 5 years of Nero's reign, known to later generations as the Quinquennium Neronis, were remembered as a time of good government, reduced taxation, and relative harmony between the emperor and the Senate. But the arrangement could not last forever. Nero grew older and increasingly resentful of the controls placed upon him. He chafed against the influence of his mother, who expected to rule through him, and who interfered constantly in matters of state, and even in his personal life. The relationship between mother and son deteriorated into bitter hostility. Agrippina threatened to support Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius whom Nero had displaced as heir. Shortly thereafter, Britannicus died suddenly at a banquet, allegedly poisoned on Nero's orders, though the emperor claimed the boy had simply suffered an epileptic seizure. Agrippina's threats had been silenced, but her influence remained a source of friction and resentment. In AD 59, Nero took the extraordinary step of having his own mother murdered. The accounts of her death read like something from a theatrical melodrama, which perhaps was fitting for an emperor who fancied himself an artist. First, Nero attempted to kill her by means of a collapsing boat designed to sink in the Bay of Naples. Agrippina survived, swimming to shore despite her injuries. When subtlety failed, Nero resorted to directness. He sent soldiers to her villa, where they beat her to death. Ancient sources report that her last words as the assassins approached were to strike her womb, the womb that had borne such a monster. Whether true or invented, the story captures the horror that Romans felt at this ultimate violation of family bonds. The Great Fire of Rome in July of AD 64 became the defining catastrophe of Nero's entire reign and one of the most devastating disasters in the long history of the ancient city. The fire burned for 6 terrible days and nights, destroying vast swaths of the city that had taken centuries to build. Of Rome's 14 administrative districts, 3 were completely leveled to bare ground and 7 more were severely damaged. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary people were left homeless, their possessions and their livelihoods reduced to smoldering ash. Ancient temples that had stood for centuries were consumed by the flames. The human suffering was immense, and the destruction of irreplaceable monuments and records was a blow to Roman identity itself. Nero was at Antium when the fire broke out and returned to Rome to organize relief efforts, opening his own gardens to refugees and arranging for food supplies to be distributed at reduced prices. Yet despite these efforts, rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire to be set, supposedly so that he could rebuild Rome according to his own grandiose architectural vision. The story that he played the lyre and sang while watching Rome burn, though almost certainly false, became one of the most enduring images of his reign. Whether or not Nero started the fire, he certainly took advantage of the destruction to build his magnificent Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a vast palace complex that sprawled across the devastated neighborhoods in the heart of Rome. The scale and extravagance of this project fueled resentment and confirmed suspicions about the emperor's priorities. To deflect blame for the fire, Nero turned upon a small religious sect that had recently appeared in Rome. The Christians, as they were called, followed the teachings of a Jewish preacher who had been executed in Judea some 3 decades earlier. They were already regarded with suspicion by many Romans, who found their practices strange and their refusal to honor the traditional gods offensive. Nero accused them of starting the fire and subjected them to horrific punishments. According to the historian Tacitus, writing a generation later, Christians were covered with animal skins and torn apart by dogs, or they were crucified, or they were set alight to serve as human torches illuminating Nero's gardens at night. This persecution, though brief, marked the first organized Roman action against Christianity and would be remembered by later generations of Christians as a founding moment of martyrdom. As the years passed, Nero devoted himself increasingly to his artistic pursuits, performing publicly as a singer, actor, and charioteer in ways that shocked traditional Roman sensibilities. Emperors were supposed to maintain a certain dignity, to embody the gravitas that Romans valued so highly. Nero performed on stage, competed in athletic contests, and accepted prizes that no one dared deny him. He traveled to Greece to participate in the great festivals there. Winning every competition, he entered through a combination of flattery, fear, and the judges' understandable reluctance to offend the ruler of the known world. To Nero, these performances were expressions of his artistic genius. To many Romans, they were humiliating spectacles that degraded the imperial office. In AD 65, a major conspiracy against Nero was discovered. The conspiracy, known to history as the Pisonian Conspiracy after its nominal figurehead Gaius Calpurnius Piso, involved senators, wealthy knights, military officers, and even trusted members of the Praetorian Guard itself. The conspirators planned to assassinate Nero and install Piso as emperor. When the plot was betrayed, Nero responded with a wave of executions, forced suicides, and exiles that decimated the Roman elite. Among those compelled to take their own lives was Seneca, Nero's former tutor and advisor, who died with philosophical calm, opening his veins in a warm bath while discoursing on the immortality of the soul. The poet Lucan, Seneca's nephew and the author of an epic poem on the civil wars, was also forced to suicide. The terror spread rapidly throughout Roman society, creating an atmosphere of fear and constant suspicion. By AD 68, discontent with Nero's rule had reached an absolute breaking point across the empire. Revolts broke out in the provinces of Gaul and Spain, led by ambitious provincial governors who commanded battle-hardened legions, and who saw in the chaos an opportunity to seize supreme power for themselves. The initial rebellion in Gaul was suppressed with great bloodshed, but the revolt in Spain, led by the elderly but capable Servius Sulpicius Galba, steadily gained momentum and attracted more supporters with each passing week. More ominously, the legions along the Rhine and the Danube began to waver in their loyalty. The Praetorian Guard in Rome itself, the emperor's last line of defense, was persuaded to abandon Nero by their new prefect, who had been promised rewards by Galba's supporters. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy, condemning him to be executed in the ancient manner, beaten to death with rods. Nero fled Rome in the dark of night with only a handful of loyal freedmen, taking refuge in a modest villa a few miles outside the city walls. As the sound of approaching horsemen reached his ears in the gray light of dawn, he prepared to take his own life rather than face the humiliation of capture and the agony of public execution. Yet even at this final moment, his theatrical nature asserted itself. He reportedly lamented what an artist the world was losing in him, and he required assistance from a freedman to drive the dagger into his own throat. He died on the 9th of June AD 68, at the young age of 30 years. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the remarkable family that had ruled the Roman world for nearly a century since Augustus had established the Principate in the aftermath of civil war. With his death, that extraordinary lineage came to its final end, and Rome plunged once again into a terrible year of civil war as rival generals fought desperately for the vacant throne. The death of Nero opened a wound in the Roman state that would take nearly 2 years of bloodshed and chaos to heal. For the first time since the civil wars that had brought Augustus to power more than a century before, Roman legions marched against each other in open warfare, and the secret of empire was finally revealed, as the historian Tacitus would later write with bitter insight, that an emperor could be made somewhere other than Rome itself. The terrible year that followed AD 69 would see 4 different men claim the purple in rapid succession, each rising to power on the swords of his loyal soldiers, and each falling when those same swords inevitably turned against him. It was a year of chaos, bloodshed, and uncertainty that shook the foundations of the Principate and reminded Romans of the terrible civil wars their grandfathers had survived. The first of these 4 emperors was Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly governor of Spain whose revolt had helped bring down Nero. Galba was born in the year 3 BC, making him 70 years old when he claimed the throne. He came from an ancient and distinguished patrician family, and he had served the empire faithfully for decades as a military commander and provincial administrator. He was known for his old-fashioned severity, his fiscal conservatism, and his rigid adherence to traditional Roman values. These qualities had made him an effective governor in peacetime, but they would prove disastrous weaknesses in the dangerous months that followed his accession. Galba entered Rome in the autumn of AD 68, escorted by his loyal Spanish legions and formally acclaimed by the grateful Senate. He inherited an empire in severe financial crisis, its treasury utterly drained by Nero's wild extravagances and reckless spending on monuments to his own glory. His response was to impose strict austerity measures, refusing to pay the generous bonuses that Roman soldiers had come to expect as their rightful due when a new emperor took power. The Praetorian Guard, which had been promised substantial rewards for abandoning the doomed Nero, received nothing but stern lectures about duty and tradition. The legions in Germany, which had expected recognition for their role in the transfer of power, were likewise disappointed. Galba reportedly declared that he levied soldiers rather than bought them, a sentiment admirable in principle but catastrophic in practice. An emperor who would not pay his troops was an emperor whose days were numbered. Beyond his financial severity, Galba surrounded himself with advisors who were widely despised. 3 men in particular dominated his court and attracted intense hatred. Titus Vinius was seen as corrupt and greedy. Cornelius Laco, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, was considered incompetent and arrogant. Icelus, a freedman who had been one of Galba's trusted servants, was resented for his influence over the aging emperor. Romans began to joke bitterly that Galba would have been capable of ruling if only he had not ruled. His virtues belonged to another age. The world had changed and Galba had not changed with it. As discontent grew, Galba made a fateful decision regarding the succession. He had no children of his own and needed to adopt an heir to secure the future of his regime. On the 10th of January AD 69, he formally adopted Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus, a young nobleman of distinguished lineage, but no military experience and no popular following. The choice outraged Marcus Salvius Otho, a former friend of Nero who had supported Galba's revolt and who had confidently expected to be named heir himself. Otho had accumulated massive debts in the expectation of becoming emperor. Now passed over for a younger man, he faced financial ruin and political obscurity. Desperation drove him to conspiracy. Otho moved with remarkable speed and decisiveness. On the 15th of January AD 69, just 5 days after Galba had publicly adopted Piso as his successor in a formal ceremony, a small group of Praetorian guardsmen quietly escorted Otho to the Praetorian camp outside the city walls, where he was enthusiastically acclaimed emperor by the assembled soldiers. The conspirators were remarkably few in number at the start, perhaps no more than 23 men, but their boldness carried the day. When news of the revolt reached the Forum, Galba was uncertain how to respond. Some advisors urged him to remain in the palace. Others insisted he confront the rebels directly. He chose to go out and face the crisis, carried through the streets in a litter because his age made walking difficult. It was a fatal error. In the Forum, the old emperor was abandoned by his guards and surrounded by soldiers loyal to Otho. They cut him down without ceremony or hesitation, along with Piso and Vinius. Galba's last words, according to some accounts, were to offer his throat to the swordsmen and tell them to strike if it would serve the state. His head was hacked off and carried through the streets on a spear. His body was left in the Forum, where passers-by kicked it and mocked the fallen emperor. He had ruled for just 7 months. His death demonstrated with brutal clarity how fragile imperial power had become when it rested solely on the loyalty of soldiers who could be bought or frightened. Marcus Salvius Otho was now emperor of Rome, master of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. He was 36 years old, a man of considerable personal charm and social grace, but questionable moral character and uncertain judgment. In his youth, he had been one of Nero's closest companions and most intimate friends, sharing in all the pleasures and vices of that dissolute and extravagant court. He had been married to the beautiful Poppaea Sabina, whom Nero had taken for himself, forcing Otho into a kind of honorable exile as governor of Lusitania, the remote province we now know as Portugal. There he had remained for 10 long years, waiting patiently for fortune to change and opportunity to present itself. Now fortune had changed beyond even his wildest dreams, and he sat upon the throne of the Caesars. But Otho's position was precarious from the very first day of his reign. The legions stationed along the Rhine frontier in Germany had already proclaimed their own candidate for emperor before Galba had even fallen. On the 1st of January AD 69, 2 full weeks before Galba's murder in the Forum, the legions of Lower Germany had refused to renew their traditional oath of allegiance to Galba and had instead enthusiastically acclaimed their own commander Aulus Vitellius as emperor. News of this dangerous rival claim reached Rome soon after Otho took power. There would be no peaceful resolution. 2 armies, 2 emperors, and only 1 throne. Civil war was now inevitable. Otho proved more capable than his critics expected. He quickly secured the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard and the legions stationed in the Balkans and the East. He attempted to negotiate with Vitellius, offering to share power or to marry Vitellius's daughter, but these overtures were rejected. Vitellius's generals were already marching toward Italy with a powerful army of veteran soldiers from the Rhine frontier, men hardened by years of warfare against the Germanic tribes. Otho had no choice but to fight. The decisive confrontation came in mid-April of AD 69, near the small town of Bedriacum in the fertile plains of northern Italy. Otho's forces were outnumbered by the veteran legions from the Rhine and outgeneraled by more experienced commanders who knew how to handle large armies in the field. His advisors had urged him to wait for reinforcements from the Balkans, troops who were marching to join him but had not yet arrived. But Otho, perhaps impatient for resolution, perhaps despairing of his chances the longer the war dragged on, ordered an immediate attack against the advice of his best generals. The Battle of Bedriacum was a complete disaster for the Othonian forces. Though the fighting was fierce and losses were heavy on both sides, Otho's army was routed and driven from the field. Many of his soldiers fled or surrendered. The road to Rome lay open to the Vitellian forces. When news of the crushing defeat reached Otho at his headquarters, his officers urged him to continue the fight. Substantial reinforcements from the Balkan legions were on the way and would arrive within days. The war was not yet lost, they insisted, and many battles had been won after initial setbacks. But Otho refused to prolong the bloodshed. He declared solemnly that he would not sacrifice more Roman lives in a civil war fought merely for his own ambition and personal survival. Whether this decision reflected genuine nobility of character, a sincere desire to spare further suffering, or simply the clear-eyed recognition that further resistance was futile and would only delay the inevitable, we cannot know for certain. On the morning of the 16th of April AD 69, having made his decision, Otho retired to his tent, calmly settled all his affairs, distributed generous gifts to his servants and freedmen, and then fell upon his own sword with a steady hand. He was 37 years old and had ruled the Roman Empire for just 95 tumultuous days. His noble suicide won him a lasting reputation for honor and courage that his dissolute life had not earned him. Even his enemies and most bitter critics admitted that in the end he had died well and bravely. With Otho dead by his own hand and his once loyal armies scattered or surrendered to the victors, the road to Rome lay open before the victorious forces of Aulus Vitellius. The third emperor of this terrible year of chaos and bloodshed now prepared to claim his prize, the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Vitellius was born on the 7th of September, in the year AD 15, into a family that had risen to prominence and wealth through faithful service to the Julio-Claudian emperors over several generations. His father had been a trusted advisor to the Emperor Claudius and had held the consulship 3 times, an extraordinary and almost unprecedented honor that reflected the family's high standing at court. The younger Vitellius had grown up in the imperial palace, surrounded by the intrigues and pleasures of that dangerous world. He was known for his affability, his love of good food and wine, and his complete lack of military distinction. It was precisely this lack of ambition that had made Vitellius an attractive choice for the restless legions of Germany. The soldiers wanted an emperor they could control, a man who would reward them generously and interfere little in their affairs. Vitellius seemed perfect for the role. He was genial and easygoing, happy to let others handle the details of government while he enjoyed the benefits of his position. When the legions acclaimed him emperor on the 1st of January, AD 69, he accepted the honor with apparent reluctance but also with evident pleasure. His generals had won his throne for him. Now he would enjoy it. The march to Italy had been marked by violence and disorder. The Germanic legions were rough men, accustomed to hard fighting and hard living on the frontier. They treated Italy like conquered territory, plundering and pillaging as they advanced. Towns that resisted were sacked. Civilians who offended the soldiers were killed. By the time the army reached Rome, it had left a trail of devastation across northern Italy. The Roman people, who had hoped for stability after the chaos of the previous months, found themselves subjects of an occupying army rather than citizens of a restored state. Vitellius entered Rome in July of AD 69, amid scenes of celebration that masked the underlying tension. He immediately set about rewarding his supporters, distributing offices and honors to his generals and their allies. He disbanded the existing Praetorian Guard, which had supported first Galba and then Otho, replacing them with soldiers from his own Germanic legions. These new guardsmen were larger, rougher, and more foreign in manner than the Italians they replaced, and their presence in the city was a constant reminder that Rome was under military occupation. The new emperor's appetites quickly became legendary. Ancient sources describe banquets of staggering excess, with multiple courses of rare delicacies consumed over hours of feasting. Vitellius was said to have spent millions of sesterces on food alone during his brief reign. Whether these accounts are exaggerated or not, they reflect the perception that Vitellius cared more for his pleasures than for the responsibilities of governing. While he feasted, his advisors managed the empire, and his soldiers grew increasingly restless for the rewards they had been promised. But even as Vitellius settled into his comfortable role as emperor, eating and drinking and enjoying the pleasures of the palace, a new and far more dangerous threat was emerging in the east. The powerful legions stationed in Egypt, Judea, and Syria had watched the chaos unfolding in Rome with growing alarm and resentment. They too wanted a say in who ruled the empire, and they too had their own candidate, a man far more capable than any who had claimed the purple thus far. On the 1st of July AD 69, the prefect of Egypt formally proclaimed Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the experienced commander of the Roman forces in Judea, as emperor of Rome. Vespasian, as he is known to history, was a successful general who was in the midst of suppressing a Jewish revolt when the news reached him. He was a man of very different character from Vitellius, frugal where Vitellius was extravagant, disciplined where Vitellius was self-indulgent. The eastern legions were soon joined by the powerful armies of the Danube frontier, troops who had been marching south to support Otho when the unexpected news of his suicide reached them on the road. These soldiers felt cheated of their chance to fight, robbed of the glory and plunder they had anticipated, and they were now eager to support any candidate who would give them another opportunity to prove themselves in battle and share in the spoils of victory. Under the bold and aggressive command of Marcus Antonius Primus, a general who was as ruthless as he was capable, the Danubian legions began their fateful march toward Italy in late summer of AD 69. Vitellius now faced a war on two fronts, with enemies approaching from both the east and the north. The response of Vitellius to this mounting crisis was characteristically sluggish and ineffective. He seemed utterly unable to grasp the seriousness of the situation facing him, or to take the decisive military action that might have saved his throne and his life. His generals urged him to march north and confront the Danubian legions before they could reach Italy, but Vitellius delayed, enjoying one more banquet, attending one more spectacle, finding excuses to remain in the comfort of Rome. When his forces finally moved to intercept the enemy, they were poorly coordinated and badly led. The initiative had been lost, and the Flavian forces were advancing rapidly. The Second Battle of Bedriacum, fought in the last days of October of AD 69 on the same blood-soaked ground where Otho's forces had been defeated just 6 months before, decided the fate of Vitellius and his short-lived regime. The Vitellian forces, though numerous and not lacking in courage, were outmatched by the aggressive and relentless tactics of Antonius Primus, who drove his men forward with fierce determination. The battle raged through the night hours, a chaotic and extraordinarily bloody affair illuminated by torches and burning buildings, that ended only with the complete and utter rout of Vitellius's demoralized army. The survivors of the battle fled in all directions, many throwing away their weapons and armor. The road to Rome was open once again, this time to a vengeful Flavian army hungry for revenge against the soldiers who had plundered and pillaged their way south just a few months before. As news of the crushing defeat at Bedriacum spread throughout the empire, Vitellius desperately attempted to negotiate for his life. He offered to abdicate the throne, to retire into quiet private life, to accept any terms at all that would spare him from death. But events had moved far beyond his ability to control them. The Flavian forces were advancing rapidly on Rome, and within the city itself, supporters of Vespasian were rising up in open revolt. Fierce and bloody street fighting erupted between the remaining Vitellian soldiers and Flavian sympathizers. The great temple of Jupiter on the Capitol itself was besieged and burned to the ground, destroying ancient temples, sacred relics, and priceless historical records in a terrible conflagration that shocked Romans as deeply as the Great Fire had shocked them under Nero just 5 years before. Vitellius's own brother Sabinus was killed in the fighting, adding family tragedy to political disaster. The end for Vitellius came on the 20th of December, AD 69, a date that brought the long nightmare of civil war to its bloody conclusion. Vitellius was discovered hiding in a doorkeeper's lodge in the imperial palace, having fled desperately from room to room as the Flavian soldiers closed in around him. He was dragged out into the daylight, his hands bound behind his back, a noose placed around his neck like a common criminal. Soldiers drove him through the streets toward the Forum, tormenting and mocking him along the way, forcing him to keep his head up so that everyone could see the fallen emperor's shame and humiliation. In the Forum, where the unfortunate Galba had died less than a year before amid similar scenes of chaos and betrayal, Vitellius was killed by repeated sword thrusts from the surrounding soldiers. His mutilated body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the muddy waters of the Tiber. He had ruled for 8 months, and he had spent most of that time eating elaborate banquets while his empire crumbled around him. With Vitellius dead and his supporters scattered or in hiding, the way was at last clear for Vespasian to claim the throne he had won. The Senate met in its ancient chamber and formally proclaimed him emperor, though he was still far away in the east and would not reach Rome for many months to come. The terrible year of the 4 emperors was finally over. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius had all risen to power and fallen from it in the space of just 18 chaotic months. Only Vespasian remained standing, the unexpected founder of a new dynasty that would restore stability and good government to an empire that had been shaken to its very foundations by civil war and the struggle for power. The secret of empire had been revealed for all to see, and the price of that terrible knowledge had been paid in the blood of thousands of Roman soldiers and citizens. The man who now emerged as emperor from the wreckage of civil war was unlike any ruler who had held the throne before him. Titus Flavius Vespasianus was born on the 17th of November, in the year AD 9, in a small and unremarkable village in the Sabine country northeast of Rome. His family was respectable but far from distinguished in any way, belonging to the equestrian class of successful businessmen rather than the ancient senatorial aristocracy that had dominated Roman politics for centuries. His grandfather had been a common soldier who rose through the ranks by his own merit and determination. His father was a tax collector and money lender in the provinces, a necessary occupation but not one that commanded great respect. There was nothing in his ancestry to suggest imperial destiny, no connection to the divine Augustus or the great families of the Republic. He was, in Roman terms, a new man, and his rise to the purple demonstrated that ability and circumstance could matter more than bloodline. Vespasian had built his career through decades of solid military service and competent administrative work. He had served in Thrace as a young officer, in Crete as a quaestor, and in Africa as a provincial governor. He had commanded a legion with distinction during the invasion of Britain under Claudius, fighting more than 30 engagements against the native tribes and subduing 2 powerful British kingdoms, achievements for which he was awarded triumphal ornaments. He had held the consulship in AD 51, an honor that was quite remarkable for someone of his relatively humble background. By the time Nero sent him to Judea in AD 67 to suppress the Jewish revolt, he was a proven general with decades of experience. He was also 60 years old, an age when most Romans would have been thinking of retirement rather than rebellion. But the chaos of the year 69 had presented an opportunity that he was shrewd enough to seize. Vespasian did not reach Rome until October of AD 70, nearly a year after the Senate had proclaimed him emperor. He had remained in the east, securing his base of support and allowing his generals to win his throne for him. His son Titus was left to complete the siege of Jerusalem, a task that would culminate in the destruction of the temple and the dispersal of the Jewish people. Meanwhile, Vespasian traveled slowly westward, receiving delegations, consolidating alliances, and preparing for the enormous task of reconstruction that awaited him. When he finally entered Rome, he came not as a conquering general seeking glory, but as a practical administrator ready to restore order. The empire he inherited was in truly desperate condition after the chaos of civil war. The treasury had been completely emptied by Nero's legendary extravagance and the subsequent wars between rival claimants to the throne. The armies were demoralized and restless, having learned during the year of 4 emperors that they could make and unmake rulers at will. The city of Rome itself bore the visible scars of street fighting, and the burned and blackened temple of Jupiter on the Capitol stood as a stark and terrible reminder of how close the entire Roman state had come to complete collapse. Vespasian approached these challenges with the same methodical determination that had characterized his military career. He would not be flashy or dramatic. He would simply do what needed to be done. His fiscal policies were the essential foundation of his restoration of the Roman state. Vespasian understood with perfect clarity that without money, nothing else was possible. He raised taxes throughout the empire, both by increasing existing rates and by implementing far more efficient collection methods. He taxed items and activities that had previously escaped official assessment. Most famously and most controversially, he imposed a tax on the use of public urinals throughout Rome, collecting the urine for sale to tanners and fullers who used it in processing leather and cleaning cloth. When his son Titus complained that this particular tax was undignified and beneath the majesty of the imperial office, Vespasian held up a gold coin from the very first day's collection and asked whether it smelled bad to him. The point was clear. Money was money, regardless of its source, and the empire needed every coin it could gather. Beyond taxation, Vespasian found money through the sale of offices and privileges, the confiscation of estates from those who had supported his enemies, and the revival of lapsed claims and forgotten debts owed to the state. His critics accused him of greed and even of deliberately prosecuting wealthy men in order to seize their property. There was perhaps some truth to these charges. But Vespasian also spent the money he raised on rebuilding the empire. He restored the capital and its temples. He improved roads and bridges throughout the provinces. He founded new colonies and supported existing cities with grants and tax relief. The wealth he accumulated flowed back into the infrastructure that held the empire together. The most visible and enduring symbol of Vespasian's reign was the great amphitheater that he began building in the very heart of Rome. The Flavian Amphitheater, as it was officially and formally known, rose on the site of the artificial lake that had graced the grounds of Nero's Golden House. Where Nero had built a private paradise for himself, surrounded by gardens and pavilions for his exclusive enjoyment, Vespasian would create a vast public entertainment venue for all the people of Rome. The message was deliberate and utterly unmistakable to everyone who saw it rise. The new Flavian dynasty served the citizens of Rome, not its own pleasures and vanity. The amphitheater would become the largest structure of its kind ever built in the entire Roman world, capable of holding 50,000 eager spectators for gladiatorial combats and elaborate wild beast hunts. We know it today by another and more famous name, the Colosseum, and though Vespasian would not live to see it fully completed, it remains his most enduring monument to this day. Vespasian's personal style was as different from his predecessors as his policies. He cultivated an image of plain dealing and simple tastes that contrasted sharply with the extravagance of Nero and the self-indulgence of Vitellius. He rose early and worked long hours. He received petitions and heard legal cases in person. He maintained open access to the palace, allowing ordinary citizens to approach him with their concerns. His sense of humor was earthy and self-deprecating. When flatterers tried to trace his ancestry back to the gods or to the founders of Rome, he laughed at them. He knew who he was and where he came from, and he saw no need to pretend otherwise. His family, unlike the troubled dynasties of the Julio-Claudians, was remarkably stable and supportive. His two sons, Titus and Domitian, were groomed for succession from the beginning. Titus, the elder, was associated with his father in government, serving effectively as co-emperor and commanding the legions with distinction. The capture of Jerusalem in AD 70 had made Titus a celebrated military hero, and his loyalty to his father was never in doubt. Domitian, the younger son, was less trusted and kept at a distance from real power, but he too was clearly part of the dynastic succession. For the first time since Augustus, there would be no uncertainty about who would follow the current emperor. Vespasian ruled for 10 years, from AD 69 to AD 79, a decade that transformed the empire from a state on the brink of collapse to one of renewed stability and confidence. He reformed the army, rewarding loyal units and punishing those that had changed sides too easily during the civil wars. He extended citizenship to communities in Spain and Gaul, continuing the policy of incorporating provincials into the Roman system. He patronized literature and the arts, supporting writers and establishing endowed professorships in rhetoric. Though he was no intellectual himself, he understood the value of culture in legitimizing his new dynasty. Vespasian died on the 23rd of June AD 79 at the age of 69 years, having ruled the empire for a decade of restoration and renewal. He had been ill for some time, suffering from what ancient sources describe as recurring fever and severe intestinal complaints that gradually weakened him. As death approached and he felt his strength failing, he reportedly joked with those around him that he thought he was becoming a god, a wry and characteristically earthy reference to the deification that awaited deceased emperors who had served Rome well. His final words, according to the tradition preserved by later writers, were that an emperor should die on his feet, standing and working rather than lying in bed. True to his nature, he attempted to rise from his sickbed and collapsed into the arms of his attendants who rushed to catch him. It was a death worthy of the man himself, practical and dignified to the very last moment. The Senate promptly voted to deify him, enrolling him among the gods of Rome, and the succession passed smoothly and peacefully to his elder son Titus, exactly as Vespasian had carefully planned. He had saved the empire from chaos and founded a new dynasty to guide it into the future. It was an achievement that would have seemed utterly impossible to the poor boy from the Sabine Hills who had begun his career with nothing but his own ability and determination. The new emperor who succeeded Vespasian was in many ways his father's complete opposite in temperament and style. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, named for his father but destined to be remembered simply as Titus, was born on the 30th of December in the year AD 39 in Rome itself. Where his father had been plain-spoken and rigorously frugal, Titus was naturally charming and remarkably generous with his wealth. Where Vespasian had been cautious and methodical in all things, Titus was bold and decisive, willing to take risks that his more conservative father would have avoided. He had grown up in the imperial court during the dangerous years of the Julio-Claudians, educated alongside Britannicus, the ill-fated son of Claudius, and trained in all the arts and accomplishments that a Roman nobleman of the highest rank was expected to master. He was handsome, athletic, and culturally refined, fluent in Greek as well as Latin, skilled in music and poetry as well as warfare. He seemed born to rule, and his reign, though tragically brief, would earn him a reputation as one of the best emperors Rome ever had. His military credentials were beyond question. The siege and capture of Jerusalem in AD 70 had established him as a commander of the first rank, though the destruction of the Jewish temple remained controversial. Some praised him for bringing a difficult war to a decisive conclusion. Others questioned whether the complete destruction of a sacred site had been necessary or wise. Titus himself seems to have had mixed feelings about his greatest military achievement. Ancient sources suggest that he declined the honor of a wreath after the victory, saying that he had merely served as an instrument of divine wrath. Whether this represents genuine scruple or diplomatic modesty, we cannot know. Before his accession, Titus had acquired a reputation for ruthlessness that worried many Romans. As commander of the Praetorian Guard under his father, he had taken a hard line against anyone suspected of disloyalty. Informers were employed, conspiracies were ruthlessly suppressed, and those convicted of treason were executed without mercy. He had conducted an affair with Berenice, a Jewish princess from the Herodian dynasty, bringing her to Rome and treating her almost as his wife. This relationship scandalized Roman society, which remembered all too well the disaster of Mark Antony's passion for the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. Many feared that Titus would prove another Nero, a ruler who sacrificed duty to pleasure and cruelty. These fears proved entirely unfounded. From the moment of his accession on the 24th of June, AD 79, Titus transformed himself into a model ruler. He sent Berenice away from Rome, recognizing that the relationship was politically impossible. He ended the practice of prosecuting men for treason on flimsy evidence, declaring that no senator would be executed during his reign. He opened the imperial treasury to relieve suffering, showed mercy to those who had opposed him, and cultivated a relationship with the Senate based on mutual respect rather than fear. The change was so dramatic that some historians have suggested he was simply revealing his true nature, freed at last from the constraints of serving as his father's enforcer. His reign began under a dark and terrible omen. Less than 2 months after Titus became emperor, on the 24th of August, AD 79, Mount Vesuvius erupted with catastrophic violence that stunned the entire Roman world. The eruption buried the thriving cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under thick layers of volcanic ash, pumice stone, and superheated mud, killing thousands of people in a single day and destroying prosperous communities that had flourished along the beautiful Bay of Naples for centuries. The elder Pliny, the famous naturalist and author of an encyclopedic work on natural history that contained thousands of entries, died while attempting to rescue survivors by boat, overcome by the toxic volcanic gases that billowed from the mountain. His nephew, the younger Pliny, watched the disaster unfold from across the Bay of Naples and later wrote vivid letters describing the terror and confusion of that day. Titus responded to the disaster with energy and compassion that won him widespread admiration. He traveled to the affected region personally, surveying the damage and organizing relief efforts. He appointed commissioners to oversee the recovery and allocated substantial funds from the treasury to help survivors rebuild their lives. The property of those who had died without heirs was directed to the reconstruction effort, rather than being absorbed into the imperial coffers. Titus's handling of the Vesuvius disaster became a model of imperial crisis response, demonstrating how an emperor could use his power to alleviate suffering rather than to exploit it. But the catastrophes were not finished with Rome and its new emperor. In AD 80, a devastating fire swept through Rome once again, burning for 3 terrible days and destroying large portions of the city that had only recently been rebuilt after the Great Fire under Nero 16 years before. The Campus Martius, the great public gathering place of Rome, the sacred Capitoline Hill with its restored temples, and the magnificent Pantheon of Agrippa were all damaged or completely destroyed by the flames. Once again, as he had after Vesuvius, Titus responded with remarkable generosity, using his own personal wealth as well as public funds from the treasury to finance the enormous reconstruction effort. He reportedly said that the losses were his own personal burden, not the people's, a statement that reflects the paternalistic ideology of Roman imperial rule at its very best. The people were his children, and their suffering was his own responsibility to address. That same remarkable year, Titus presided over the dedication and official opening of the Flavian Amphitheater, the great Colosseum that his father had begun but had not lived to see completed. The inaugural games lasted for an astonishing 100 days and were among the most spectacular entertainments ever seen in the long history of Rome. Thousands of gladiators fought and died in the arena to the roar of the crowds. Exotic wild beasts from every distant corner of the empire, including lions, elephants, and creatures that most Romans had never seen, were displayed and killed for popular amusement. Naval battles were even staged by flooding the arena floor with water and bringing in warships to fight before the amazed spectators. The games were criticized by some thoughtful Romans as wasteful and unnecessarily cruel, but they served an important political purpose, demonstrating the wealth and power of the Flavian dynasty and providing entertainment for a populace that had endured years of civil war and recent natural disaster. A plague struck Rome during his reign, adding another layer of misery to a population already strained by fire and disaster. Ancient sources do not provide enough detail to identify the disease with certainty, but they describe significant mortality and widespread fear. Titus responded as he had to every other crisis, with personal attention and generous funding. He visited the sick, participated in religious ceremonies to appease the gods, and maintained public morale through his visible presence and evident concern. Whether these devoted efforts had any practical effect on the actual course of the disease is impossible to say, but they cemented his lasting reputation as an emperor who genuinely cared for his people. Despite his many virtues and the affection he had earned from the Roman people, Titus's reign lasted only 2 brief years. He died on the 13th of September, AD 81, at the age of 41 years, his promising reign cut short when it had barely begun. The cause of his death remains uncertain, and was a matter of speculation even in ancient times. Most sources mention a fever that struck him suddenly and refused to break, but some ancient writers suspected poison, administered either by his ambitious brother Domitian who stood to inherit the throne, or by unknown enemies who feared his growing power and popularity. Titus himself reportedly said on his deathbed that he had made only one mistake in his entire life, though he stubbornly refused to specify what that mistake had been. This mysterious final statement has generated centuries of speculation among historians and scholars. Did he regret sending his beloved Berenice away, sacrificing his personal happiness for political necessity? Did he blame himself for some brutal act committed during the Jewish War, perhaps the destruction of the temple itself? Or was there some other secret that died with him? We will never know the answer. The people of Rome mourned Titus, as they had mourned few emperors before him in the long history of the Principate. He was remembered for generations as the delight and darling of the human race, a phrase that captured beautifully the genuine affection he had inspired during his brief time on the throne. The Senate voted to deify him immediately and without dissent, and his memory was honored throughout the vast empire with temples and statues and commemorative inscriptions. In just over 2 years, he had demonstrated what a Roman emperor could be at his very best: generous, compassionate, and genuinely concerned for the welfare of his subjects. His early death cut tragically short a reign that might have ranked among the greatest in all of Roman history. Instead, power passed to his younger brother Domitian, a man of very different character and temperament, and the Flavian dynasty would ultimately end in the same violence and bloodshed that had destroyed so many of the dynasties that came before it. The last of the Flavian emperors came to power in the long shadow of his beloved brother, and he would never truly escape that shadow as long as he lived. Titus Flavius Domitianus, known to history simply as Domitian, was born on the 24th of October, AD 51, the younger son of Vespasian, and the brother whose fame and popularity would forever overshadow his own achievements. Where Titus had been groomed for power from an early age and given meaningful responsibilities, Domitian had been kept at the margins of the family enterprise, given honorary titles and ceremonial positions, but denied any real responsibility or authority. He had watched helplessly as his father and brother shared in the glory of the Jewish war while he remained behind in Rome, a frustrated teenager with no significant role to play in the great events that were shaping his family's remarkable destiny. This early experience of exclusion and neglect seems to have marked him deeply and permanently, fostering resentments and insecurities that would shape his entire reign as emperor. When Vespasian and Titus were fighting for the throne in AD 69, Domitian was in Rome, nominally representing the Flavian cause but largely irrelevant to the military struggle. He attempted to assert himself, issuing orders and making appointments, but his father and brother quickly curtailed his authority. During Vespasian's reign, Domitian held the consulship 6 times, an unprecedented honor that nonetheless came with no real power. He was a figurehead, displayed at ceremonies but excluded from the serious business of government. His father distrusted him. His brother, though outwardly affectionate, kept him at arm's length. By the time Domitian finally became emperor at the age of 29 upon the sudden death of his brother, he had spent his entire adult life being overlooked and systematically underestimated by everyone around him. Domitian proved to be a more capable administrator than his reputation might suggest. He took seriously his responsibilities as emperor, working long hours on the business of government and maintaining close personal attention to the details of administration. He reformed the currency, improving the silver content of Roman coins. He raised military pay, ensuring the loyalty of the legions. He sponsored an ambitious building program that transformed Rome, completing projects his father and brother had begun and adding new monuments of his own. The palace he built on the Palatine Hill was a marvel of engineering and architecture that would serve as the imperial residence for many centuries to come. He was not a passive or lazy ruler by any measure. He was determined to prove himself worthy of the position he had finally attained after so many years of waiting in the shadows. His military record was respectable if not brilliant. He campaigned personally in Germany, securing the frontier and winning a triumph that celebrated his victories over the Chatti. He fought wars along the Danube against the Dacians, a formidable enemy who would trouble Rome for generations. These campaigns were not uniformly successful. Ancient sources critical of Domitian accused him of buying peace with the Dacians rather than winning it through military superiority. But he kept the frontiers secure and maintained Roman prestige among the barbarian peoples who pressed against the empire's borders. A fair and balanced assessment of his military record would acknowledge both his genuine accomplishments and his significant limitations. It was in his relationship with the Roman Senate that Domitian's reign took its darkest turn. From the beginning, he made clear his contempt for the aristocratic traditions that the Senate represented. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a title that shocked Romans who remembered the carefully maintained fictions of the Augustan settlement. He appointed himself censor for life, giving himself permanent authority over the membership and morals of the senatorial class. He attended Senate meetings only to announce decisions already made, treating the ancient body as a rubber stamp rather than a partner in government. The senators, accustomed to at least the pretense of consultation, seethed with resentment. As the years of his reign passed, Domitian's suspicion of the senatorial class deepened steadily into genuine paranoia. Real conspiracies against him, including a very serious military revolt by the governor of Upper Germany in AD 89, convinced him that he was surrounded by enemies who wished him dead. He responded with a reign of terror that recalled the darkest and most frightening days of Tiberius and Nero. Informers were actively encouraged to denounce senators for treason, real or imagined. Trials were conducted with predetermined outcomes, the verdicts decided before the evidence was even heard. Executions and forced suicides thinned the ranks of the aristocracy with grim regularity. Property was confiscated to fill the imperial treasury. The philosopher Epictetus was expelled from Rome along with other teachers whose ideas might encourage resistance. An oppressive atmosphere of fear descended upon the capital city. The ancient sources paint Domitian as a monster, a cruel and suspicious tyrant who delighted in the suffering of others. They describe him spending hours alone, catching flies and stabbing them with a stylus. They accuse him of every vice, from sexual depravity to sadistic cruelty. How much of this is accurate, and how much is the revenge of senatorial writers whose class had suffered under his rule, is impossible to determine with certainty. The senators who survived his reign wrote the histories, and they had every reason to blacken his memory. Modern historians have attempted to rehabilitate Domitian's reputation, pointing to his administrative competence and the stability of the provinces under his rule. The truth probably lies somewhere between the hostile ancient portrait and the revisionist modern one. What is certain beyond any doubt is that Domitian met his end violently, murdered by those closest to him. On the 18th of September AD 96, a carefully planned conspiracy of court officials succeeded where multiple senatorial plots had failed. The conspirators included members of his own imperial household, freedmen and trusted servants who had daily access to the emperor's private chambers and knew his routines intimately. His wife Domitia may have been involved in the plot, though the evidence for her participation remains ambiguous and debated. The assassins struck him in his bedroom in the early hours of the day, stabbing him multiple times before he could call for help or defend himself. He was 44 years old and had ruled the Roman Empire for 15 long years. His violent death ended the Flavian dynasty forever and ushered in a new and very different era of Roman history. The Senate's response to Domitian's assassination revealed the full depth of hatred that his reign had inspired among the aristocracy. They voted immediately and unanimously to damn his memory, a formal condemnation known as Damnatio Memoriae that ordered his name erased from all public monuments and his statues torn down and destroyed throughout the empire. The arches and temples he had built at such enormous expense were rededicated to other purposes or left to stand as anonymous monuments stripped of their creator's identity. It was as if the senators hoped to erase him from history itself, to pretend that his 15 years of rule had never happened, that the terror he had imposed could be forgotten along with his very name. They succeeded only partially in their effort to erase him from memory. Domitian's buildings still stand in Rome today, and his reign, however controversial it remains, was an important and significant chapter in the story of imperial Rome that cannot simply be ignored or forgotten. And so we come at last to the end of our journey through the first century of the Roman Empire. We have traveled from Augustus, the cautious and calculating founder, who transformed a war-torn republic into a stable monarchy that would endure for centuries, through the troubled and often violent reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. We have witnessed the chaos and bloodshed of the year of 4 emperors, when the secret of empire was revealed for all to see and Roman legions fought against each other for the right to make an emperor. We have seen the patient restoration under Vespasian, the brief golden reign of Titus that promised so much, and the dark tyranny of Domitian that ended the Flavian line. Through it all, through madness and murder and civil war, the empire itself endured, its institutions proving stronger than the flaws and failures of individual rulers. Rest now, and let these names settle gently into your memory like autumn leaves drifting slowly to the bottom of a still and quiet pond. Augustus and Tiberius, Caligula and Claudius, Nero and Galba, Otho and Vitellius, Vespasian and Titus and Domitian. They lived and ruled and died, each in their own way, each leaving their distinctive mark upon the vast empire they commanded. Some were wise, some were cruel, some were competent administrators who kept the machinery of empire running smoothly, and some were disasters who brought suffering to millions. Together they shaped the first century of the Roman Empire, establishing patterns of rule and succession that would echo through the centuries to come. The story continues, of course, stretching far into the future. New dynasties will rise and eventually fall. New emperors will face new challenges and new threats. But that is a tale for another time and another night. For now, let the silence settle gently around you, and carry these ancient stories with you into peaceful sleep. And so we pause here at the end of our journey through the first century of Imperial Rome, to reflect upon what we have witnessed. 11 emperors have passed before us, each unique in character and circumstance, yet each grappling with the same fundamental challenges that the founder Augustus left unresolved. For all his genius in creating a new system of government, Augustus never solved the most basic question of all: How would power pass from one ruler to the next? The Roman Republic had endured for 5 centuries precisely because power was shared and rotated among the aristocracy. No one man held supreme authority for long. But the Principate concentrated all real power in a single pair of hands, and when those hands grew cold in death, chaos threatened to engulf the state. We have seen the consequences of this unsolved problem play out again and again across the decades of the 1st century. Tiberius came to power as Augustus's stepson and adopted heir, but only after Augustus's preferred successors had died one by one in a pattern that seemed almost cursed, leaving the reluctant and embittered Tiberius as the last viable option. Caligula inherited the throne as the last surviving male of his immediate family, his brothers murdered by Tiberius, his father Germanicus dead under suspicious circumstances that many blamed on imperial jealousy. Claudius was dragged from behind a curtain by soldiers who desperately needed an emperor and chose the only adult male of the imperial family still breathing. Nero was skillfully maneuvered onto the throne by his ruthless and ambitious mother, displacing the rightful heir Britannicus, who would soon be dead. And when Nero fell, the chaos was complete. For emperors in a single year, each claiming legitimacy, each dying violently, until Vespasian emerged from the bloodshed to found a new dynasty. The soldiers had always been the true foundation of imperial power, but the year of the 4 emperors revealed this truth to everyone. Augustus had carefully maintained the fiction that he ruled by consent of the Senate and people, that the legions were servants of the state rather than kingmakers. That fiction died on the roads of Italy in AD 69, when Roman legions marched against each other, and the throne went to whoever commanded the most swords. Tacitus captured this dark revelation in a single memorable phrase. The secret of empire was out, that an emperor could be made elsewhere than Rome. Once the legions understood their power, there was no going back. Every subsequent emperor would rule with one eye always on his soldiers, ensuring their pay arrived on time, their conditions remained tolerable, their loyalty stayed firm. The Praetorian Guard in Rome became particularly dangerous, close enough to strike at emperors, yet expecting ever greater rewards for their support. The Senate, that ancient body which had governed Rome through the centuries of the Republic, found itself in an increasingly awkward position throughout these decades. In theory, the Senate remained the supreme governing body of the Roman state. In practice, real power resided entirely with the emperor, and the senators knew it. Some emperors, like Augustus and Vespasian, maintained polite fictions of partnership, consulting the Senate on important matters and treating its members with outward respect. Others, like Caligula and Domitian, openly humiliated the senators, making clear that their ancient privileges survived only at imperial pleasure. The senators responded with the only weapons available to them: flattery while the emperor lived, and savage criticism after he died. The histories we have inherited were written by senators or their sympathizers, which is why certain emperors are painted so darkly while others receive more generous treatment. We might pause to consider what actually made an emperor successful in the eyes of those who wrote these histories. Generosity to the aristocracy certainly mattered. So did respect for traditional forms and ceremonies, even when everyone understood they were empty rituals. Military competence helped, though not every emperor could or did lead armies personally. The ability to choose capable subordinates and trust them to govern the provinces was essential for any ruler of such a vast empire. Perhaps most importantly, successful emperors understood the difference between public image and private reality. Augustus presented himself as a simple citizen, first among equals while wielding absolute power. Vespasian played the role of the plain-spoken countryman, while his agents collected every coin the empire could produce. The emperors who failed most spectacularly were often those who could not or would not maintain these polite fictions. Consider the contrast between how these rulers presented themselves and how they actually lived. Augustus walked through the streets of Rome in a simple toga, greeting citizens by name, living in a modest house on the Palatine Hill. Yet his word was law across 100 million people, and his image gazed out from coins and statues in every city from Britain to Syria. Nero performed on stage as an artist, seeking applause from the crowds, yet he could order any man in the empire put to death with a gesture. Domitian demanded to be addressed as Lord and God, yet he spent his final years in terror of assassination, unable to trust even his closest servants. The gap between the public mask and the private reality created endless tensions that could never be fully resolved. The physical city of Rome itself changed dramatically across this first century of empire. Augustus boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and indeed the great building programs of his reign transformed the ancient capital into something magnificent and new. Subsequent emperors continued this work, each seeking to leave their mark upon the urban landscape. Nero's Golden House sprawled across the heart of the city, a monument to one man's vanity. Vespasian and Titus replaced it with the Colosseum, a gift to the people. Fire and disaster repeatedly leveled portions of the city, and each rebuilding brought new opportunities to reshape the capital according to imperial vision. The Rome that Domitian left behind at the end of the first century was almost unrecognizable compared to the Rome that Augustus had inherited from the chaos of civil war. These 11 men, for all their differences, shared the burden of ruling an empire that stretched from the mists of northern Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast to the rivers of Mesopotamia. Millions of people living in thousands of cities and countless villages looked to Rome for peace, for justice, for protection against the enemies who pressed against every frontier. The emperor could not be everywhere at once, could not personally decide every dispute or command every legion. He ruled through governors and generals, through freedmen and slaves, through a vast bureaucracy that grew larger and more complex with each passing decade. The personality of the man who wore the purple mattered, but so did the system he inherited and the servants who carried out his will. And what of the common people who lived and died while these emperors rose and fell in distant Rome? For the farmer tending his fields in Gaul, the merchant loading his ships in Alexandria, the craftsman working his trade in Ephesus. The great dramas of imperial succession were distant thunder on the horizon, important only insofar as they affected taxes and trade and the security of the roads that bound the empire together. Life continued in its ancient patterns regardless of whether Tiberius or Caligula or Claudius sat upon the throne in the imperial palace. Children were born and given names, crops were planted in spring and harvested in autumn, goods were bought and sold in marketplaces that had operated for generations, prayers were offered to the gods both old and new, and the dead were mourned and buried according to customs that predated the empire itself. The empire provided the stable framework within which ordinary life unfolded in its familiar rhythms, and as long as that framework held firm, the identity of the emperor was almost irrelevant to daily existence. Yet hold it did, through madness and murder, through fire and plague and devastating civil war. The institutions that Augustus created proved remarkably resilient, surviving rulers who seemed absolutely determined to destroy them through negligence or malice. When Caligula was murdered by his own guards, the empire did not collapse into chaos. When Nero fell and the armies marched against each other, the provinces remained largely at peace, and the administration continued to function. When Domitian was struck down by conspirators in his own bedroom, his successor Nerva could take the throne without yet another round of bloody civil war. The system worked, however imperfectly and however much it depended on the character of individual rulers, and it would continue to work for centuries yet to come. The emperors we have met tonight were only the first chapter of a much longer and more remarkable story. Let these reflections settle gently into your mind as sleep approaches and the waking world recedes. The names and dates and events may blur together as drowsiness takes hold, and that is as it should be. What remains is the sense of a world vast and ancient, of men struggling with power and its inevitable corruptions, of an empire that rose from the ashes of civil war and endured through centuries of change, shaping the world we have inherited in ways both visible and hidden. Rest now, and let the silence of those distant centuries wash over you like a gentle tide upon a quiet shore, carrying you toward peaceful dreams. We continue our journey through the ages of Rome, moving now into a period that later generations would remember as a golden age. The chaos of Domitian's final years had left the empire shaken, the Senate fearful, and the future uncertain. Yet from this darkness emerged a new line of emperors who would guide Rome through nearly a century of relative peace and prosperity. This was the era of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, and it began with an elderly senator who never expected to wear the purple. Marcus Cocceius Nerva was born on the 8th of November in the year 30 AD, in the town of Narni, nestled among the gentle hills of central Italy. His family was respected and well-established, with a long history of senatorial service stretching back through many generations. The Coccei had produced lawyers, administrators, and men of letters, though never before had one of their number reached the summit of imperial power. Nerva himself had served the empire faithfully through the reigns of multiple emperors, holding important offices and navigating the dangerous waters of imperial politics with remarkable skill and discretion. He was 66 years old when fate placed him on the throne, an age when most men of his era were long retired from public life, if they had survived at all. His hair had turned white, his step had slowed, and he likely imagined his remaining years would be spent in quiet contemplation among his books and gardens. The circumstances of his elevation were dramatic and sudden. Domitian had been struck down by assassins within his own palace, his body still warm when the conspirators turned their attention to the pressing question of succession. The Senate, so long terrorized by Domitian's suspicious nature and his willingness to execute those he perceived as threats, moved with unusual speed to fill the dangerous vacuum of power. They chose Nerva precisely because he seemed harmless, a man known for his moderation, his legal expertise, and his complete lack of military ambition. He was safe, they reasoned. He was controllable. He would restore the dignity of their ancient institution after years of humiliation. Nerva's reign lasted only 16 months, from September of 96 AD until his death in January of 98 AD. It was a brief window of time, scarcely longer than a single turn of the seasons, yet within it he accomplished much that would echo through the decades to come. His first acts were designed to heal the wounds left by his predecessor. He ended the treason trials that had terrorized the aristocracy for years, those terrible proceedings where an accusation alone could mean death, and where informers grew rich on the confiscated estates of the condemned. He recalled those who had been exiled on dubious charges, allowing families torn apart by Domitian's paranoia to reunite at last. His major achievement was restoring stability after the tyranny of Domitian's final years. He showed clemency to senators who had lived in fear. He rebuilt trust between the emperor and the aristocracy, and he introduced financial and social measures designed to help ordinary Romans. Among these was a program to purchase land and use its revenues to support poor children in Italy, a charitable endeavor that would be expanded by his successors. He also attempted tax reforms to ease the burdens on provincials, though his limited resources and brief reign restricted the scope of what he could accomplish. Yet the new emperor faced challenges that his gentle nature was ill-equipped to handle. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who served as the emperor's personal protectors and who had grown accustomed to the generous donatives of previous rulers, had been loyal to Domitian. Many of them had benefited from his reign and resented his murder. They looked upon this elderly civilian with barely concealed disdain. This bookish senator who had never commanded armies, never marched through hostile territory, never shared the hardships of military life beneath rain and sun. They demanded that Domitian's assassins be punished, placing Nerva in an impossible position. The crisis came to a head when the Praetorians essentially held Nerva hostage within the confines of his own palace. They forced him to hand over the conspirators who had killed Domitian, and the emperor, surrounded by armed men whose loyalty had vanished, had no choice but to comply. The conspirators were executed, and Nerva was left shaken, his authority in tatters. Ancient sources tell us he considered suicide in the aftermath of this humiliation. So profound was his shame at being unable to protect those who had trusted him. It was a stark reminder that in Rome, ultimate power rested not with the Senate or the people, but with the men who held the swords. Nerva's response to this crisis would prove to be his greatest and most enduring legacy. Recognizing that he lacked the military credentials to command the loyalty of the legions, and understanding that he had no biological heir to succeed him, he made a decision that would shape the next century of Roman history. In the year 97 AD, facing pressure from the Praetorian Guard and recognizing his own vulnerability, Nerva adopted the popular general Trajan as his son and successor. This created a new model of succession based on merit rather than blood, and it secured the army's loyalty by aligning the throne with the most respected military figure in the empire. This act of adoption established a precedent that would define the entire Nerva-Antonine dynasty. Rather than passing power from father to son through the accident of blood, these emperors would choose their successors based on merit and demonstrated ability. It was, in theory at least, a system designed to ensure that only the most capable men would lead the empire through whatever challenges lay ahead. The reality would prove more complicated, as it always does in human affairs. But for several generations, this approach produced a remarkable succession of competent rulers who presided over what many historians consider the peak of Roman civilization. Nerva's death appears to have been natural, but it came at a moment when his authority over the army remained fragile, making his decision to adopt Trajan the key legacy that preserved peace and allowed a smooth transfer of power. He died on the 27th of January in the year 98 AD, likely from illness that overcame his aging body. He was 67 years old and had ruled for just over a year. His body was cremated with appropriate honors, the smoke rising above the city he had tried so hard to heal, and the Senate voted to deify him, adding him to the pantheon of gods that Romans worshipped. Trajan was born on the 18th of September in the year 53 AD, in the city of Italica in the province of Hispania. This birthplace made him significant in ways that went beyond his military accomplishments, for he was the first Roman emperor to come from a provincial city outside Italy. His family had settled in Spain generations earlier, part of the gradual spread of Roman civilization across the Mediterranean world. They were provincial aristocrats, respected and successful, but not part of the ancient senatorial families that had dominated Roman politics for centuries. Trajan's rise to the purple represented a broadening of the imperial elite, a sign that talent and achievement could now outweigh the accident of birthplace. He died in August of 117 AD at Selinus in Cilicia, on his return journey from the eastern campaigns that had consumed the final years of his reign. He was 63 years old, and illness had overtaken him far from Rome, far from the city he had adorned with monuments that still bear his name. Shortly before his death, according to the official account, he confirmed Hadrian as his successor, though some ancient sources suggest the adoption was arranged by Trajan's wife Plotina after his death. Whatever the truth, the transition was accepted, and the empire passed to a new master without the bloodshed that had so often accompanied such moments. Trajan's reign lasted from January of 98 AD, when he received news of Nerva's death, until August of 117 AD, giving him about 19 years as the most powerful man in the world. During this time, the Roman Empire reached its maximum territorial extent, stretching from the mists of Britain to the burning sands of Mesopotamia, from the forests of Germany to the deserts of North Africa. No Roman before or after would rule over so vast a domain. The legions marched beneath his eagles to the shores of the Persian Gulf, and for a brief moment it seemed that no enemy could stand against the might of Rome. His major achievements include the conquest of Dacia, that rich and warlike kingdom north of the Danube in what is now Romania. The Dacians had long troubled the frontier, their king Decebalus proving a formidable opponent who had extracted tribute from Domitian. In two great campaigns, from 101 to 102 AD, and again from 105 to 106 AD, Trajan broke the Dacian kingdom utterly. Decebalus took his own life rather than be paraded in chains through Rome. The gold and silver of their mines flowed into Roman coffers, funding a massive program of public works. The conquest was commemorated in Trajan's Column, that magnificent spiral narrative carved in stone that still stands in Rome, telling the story of the wars and images that wind toward the heavens. In the east, Trajan conducted major campaigns against the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival beyond the Euphrates. He briefly extended Roman control into Armenia and Mesopotamia, capturing Ctesiphon and reaching the Persian Gulf. He is said to have stood upon those distant shores and wept, lamenting that he was too old to follow in the footsteps of Alexander. Yet these eastern conquests proved ephemeral, too extended to hold, and would be abandoned by his successor. Trajan is renowned for his monumental building projects that transformed the heart of Rome itself. His Forum, with its vast colonnaded spaces, its libraries, its basilica for the administration of justice, and that famous column at its center, represented the largest and most ambitious of all the imperial forums. Trajan's market rose nearby, a complex of shops and offices carved into the Quirinal Hill that some have called the world's first shopping mall, though such comparisons diminish its grandeur. These projects were funded by the wealth of Dacia, the spoils of conquest turned to stone and marble for the glory of Rome and the benefit of her citizens. He expanded social welfare through the Alimenta program, building upon the foundations laid by Nerva. This system used state revenues and private endowments to support poor children throughout Italy, providing them with food and the means to survive in a world that could be harsh to those without resources. It was an investment in the future, a recognition that the strength of Rome depended upon the health of her population. Trajan understood that an empire rested not only on legions and conquests, but on the people who filled the fields and workshops, who married and raised the next generation of Romans. Trajan was celebrated as an optimus princeps, the best of rulers, by later generations because he combined military success with large-scale public works and relatively cooperative relations with the Senate. He treated the senators with respect, consulted them on important matters, and avoided the tyrannical behavior that had characterized some of his predecessors. He was accessible, plain in his manners despite his power, and known for sharing the hardships of his soldiers on campaign. When he died of natural causes while still pursuing his eastern ambitions, he left behind an empire at the height of its power and a reputation that would serve as a standard against which all future emperors would be measured. Hadrian was born Publius Aelius Hadrianus on the 24th of January in the year 76 AD, either in Rome itself or in his family's ancestral home of Italica in Spain, the same city that had produced Trajan. The two families were connected by origin and by marriage, and Hadrian had been raised within Trajan's circle. Groomed for high office though never formally adopted until the very end of Trajan's life, if indeed the adoption was genuine at all. He was a complex man, brilliant and restless, passionate about Greek culture and philosophy, prone to both great generosity and sudden cruelty. He would rule the empire for more than 2 decades, and his reign would be remembered as one of consolidation rather than conquest. He died on the 10th of July in the year 138 AD at Baiae, that fashionable resort on the Bay of Naples where wealthy Romans came to escape the summer heat of the capital. He had been ill for some time, suffering from what ancient sources describe as a progressive disease that caused him great pain in his final years. Before his death, he had carefully arranged the succession, adopting Antoninus Pius and requiring Antoninus, in turn, to adopt both Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. This careful planning ensured that the empire would pass through 3 more capable rulers before the system broke down. His death came as a relief to many, for his final years had been marked by suspicion and executions that recalled the darker days of earlier reigns. Hadrian reigned from 117 AD to 138 AD, about 21 years in which the empire underwent a fundamental shift in policy from expansion to consolidation. Where Trajan had pressed outward, seeking new territories and the glory of conquest, Hadrian recognized that the empire had reached its sustainable limits. He abandoned the newly won provinces in the east, pulling back from Mesopotamia and Armenia to more defensible frontiers. This decision was controversial at the time, seen by some as a betrayal of Trajan's legacy, but it reflected a realistic assessment of what Rome could hold and defend with the resources at its disposal. His major achievements include reorganizing provincial administration to improve efficiency and fairness. He traveled extensively throughout his reign, visiting nearly every province of the empire to inspect defenses, hear complaints, review accounts, and show himself to the soldiers and civilians who lived far from Rome. No emperor before him had traveled so widely, and his journeys took him from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Britain, from the mountains of Cappadocia to the shores of the Atlantic. He standardized legal procedures, reformed tax collection, and worked to create a more uniform system of governance across the diverse territories under Roman rule. Hadrian's building program was vast and varied, reflecting his personal interests and his vision of what the empire should be. He completed or rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, that magnificent temple with its perfect dome and its opening to the sky, which stands today as one of the best-preserved buildings of the ancient world. He constructed his grand villa at Tivoli, a sprawling complex of palaces, gardens, theaters, and pools that recreated in miniature the places he had visited and loved throughout the empire. He sponsored temples, theaters, libraries, and public works in cities across the Roman world, from Athens to Jerusalem, from Alexandria to London. In Britain, he ordered the construction of the wall that still bears his name, that famous barrier of stone and turf that stretched across the narrow waste of the island from the eastern sea to the western. Hadrian's Wall was not merely a military fortification, but a statement of intent, a visible boundary marking where the Roman world ended and the unconquered lands began. It was manned by soldiers from across the empire, men from Syria and Spain, from Gaul and Africa, who stood watch over the misty hills and wondered what lay beyond in the lands of the Picts and Caledonians. Militarily, Hadrian abandoned some of Trajan's eastern conquests as unsustainable, recognizing that holding Mesopotamia would require resources the empire could not spare. He stabilized frontiers in Europe and the Near East, investing in permanent forts, roads, and walls that emphasized defense rather than new conquest. His reign saw relatively little warfare compared to his predecessor, though the brutal suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from 132 to 136 AD was a bloody exception that resulted in the destruction of Jewish communities and the renaming of the province as Syria Palestina. Hadrian was deeply interested in Greek culture and philosophy, supporting intellectuals and artists throughout the empire. He wrote poetry, designed buildings, and engaged in philosophical discussions with the learned men of his time. He grew a beard in the Greek fashion, the first emperor to do so, and his choice set a style that would be followed by his successors for generations. His personal life included his celebrated relationship with Antinous, a beautiful youth from Bithynia who drowned mysteriously in the Nile during a visit to Egypt in the year 130 AD. Hadrian's grief was profound and public, exceeding all bounds of what Romans considered appropriate. He had Antinous deified, established a cult in his honor, founded a city named Antinopolis on the spot where the youth had died, and commissioned countless statues that spread the image of his beloved across the empire. It was an extraordinary display of personal feeling from a man who could be cold and calculating in his political dealings. The circumstances of Antinous' death remain mysterious. Some ancient sources suggest he sacrificed himself in some religious rite. Others hint at accident or even murder. Whatever the truth, Hadrian's response transformed his private grief into public religion, and temples to Antinous arose from Egypt to Greece, from Asia Minor to Rome itself. The young man's face, rendered in marble and bronze by the finest sculptors of the age, became one of the most recognizable images of the ancient world. Antoninus Pius was born Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus on the 19th of September in the year 86 AD, near the town of Lanuvium in the hills south of Rome. His family was wealthy and respected, with roots in Gaul that had transplanted successfully to Italy. He had served the state in various capacities, rising through the traditional offices with quiet competence rather than brilliant distinction. He was known for his integrity, his piety toward family and gods, and his moderate temperament. These qualities recommended him to Hadrian when the aging emperor sought a successor who would preserve his legacy without seeking to undo it. He died on the 7th of March in the year 161 AD at his country estate in Laurium, reportedly after a brief fever. He was 74 years old, having ruled for nearly a quarter century, and his death came peacefully, surrounded by those he loved. His last word, according to ancient accounts, was the watchword he gave to the officer of the guard, equanimitas equanimity. It was a fitting final statement from a man who had governed with consistent calm through decades of peace. He passed power smoothly to his adopted heirs, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Antoninus Pius reigned from 138 AD to 161 AD, about 23 years, a notably peaceful and stable period often seen as the high point of the Pax Romana. During his time on the throne, there were no major wars, no great crises, no threats that required the emperor to take the field at the head of his legions. The frontiers held, the provinces prospered, and Rome enjoyed a tranquility that seemed almost miraculous. It was a reign remarkable for its lack of remarkable events, a time when good governance meant simply maintaining what had been built. His achievements focused on internal governance rather than military glory. He emphasized legal reforms that made the law more humane, offering greater protection to slaves and provincials who had often been at the mercy of harsh masters and corrupt officials. He intervened in criminal cases to ensure that punishments fit the crimes, that torture was limited, and that the accused had fair hearings. He was known for his piety and fairness, earning the name Pius not for excessive religious devotion, but for his dutiful treatment of family, gods, and the traditions of his ancestors. The Senate, which had suffered under earlier emperors, found in him a partner who respected their dignity and consulted them genuinely on important matters. Although his reign was not marked by major new conquests, Antoninus funded significant building works throughout the empire. He completed and adorned temples in honor of Hadrian, who had adopted him, and in honor of his own family members. He maintained roads, aqueducts, and public buildings in Italy and the provinces, understanding that infrastructure was the skeleton upon which the body of the state depended. In Athens and other cities of the Greek East, he sponsored construction projects that reminded local elites of Roman generosity and tied them more closely to the imperial system. In Britain, Antoninus pushed the frontier briefly northward beyond Hadrian's Wall, sponsoring the construction of a new barrier called the Antonine Wall across the narrow waste of Scotland. This turf rampart, shorter than its predecessor to the south, represented an attempt to incorporate more territory into the province. Yet it was abandoned within a generation, the legions withdrawing back to Hadrian's more defensible line, illustrating the cautious and ultimately limited approach to expansion that characterized this reign. Antoninus preferred stability to glory, a preference that served the empire well but won him less attention from later historians who found peaceful reigns less exciting to chronicle. Antoninus Pius maintained the adoptive succession system that Hadrian had established by adopting Marcus Aurelius, whom he raised almost as a son within the imperial household. He later required Marcus to adopt Lucius Verus as well, ensuring that both young men would share power when the time came. The relationship between Antoninus and Marcus was close and affectionate, blending political mentorship with genuine paternal warmth. They shared philosophical interests, discussed matters of state together, and prepared Marcus carefully for the enormous responsibilities he would one day bear. When Antoninus died, he was later deified by the Senate, an honor that recognized not just his power, but the genuine esteem in which Romans held his memory. Marcus Aurelius was born Marcus Annius Verus on the 26th of April in the year 121 AD, in Rome itself, into an aristocratic family with deep roots in the imperial establishment. His grandfather had been consul, his family was wealthy and well-connected, and from an early age he showed the serious temperament that would later make him famous. He came to the attention of Emperor Hadrian, who nicknamed him Verissimus, the most truthful one, impressed by the boy's honesty and dedication to his studies. When Hadrian arranged for Antoninus Pius to adopt him, Marcus was set on the path to supreme power while still a teenager. He died on the 17th of March in the year 180 AD, either at Vindobona or at Sirmium, both frontier cities on the Danube, where he had spent much of his final years campaigning against the Germanic tribes who pressed against the empire's northern borders. He was 58 years old, worn down by years of war, by the devastating plague that had swept through the empire, and by personal griefs that included the deaths of many of his children. Ancient sources describe a death from illness, likely a recurrence of the plague that had killed so many others, though some later accounts suggest complications from the hardships of military life. He died as he had lived, on duty, far from the comforts of Rome. Marcus Aurelius reigned from 161 AD to 180 AD, initially as co-emperor with Lucius Verus until Verus's death in 169 AD, and then alone for the remaining 11 years of his life. His reign marked a sharp contrast to the peaceful decades of Antoninus Pius, for Marcus inherited an empire already facing multiple crises. The Parthians attacked in the east, Germanic tribes raided across the Danube, and a terrible plague, brought back by soldiers returning from eastern campaigns, swept through the provinces, killing perhaps millions and disrupting the economy and military strength of the state. Marcus spent much of his reign responding to emergencies rather than pursuing the philosophical contemplation he would have preferred. His major achievements include the persistent defense of the northern frontiers during the Marcomannic Wars, a long series of campaigns against the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other Germanic peoples who had taken advantage of the plague's devastation to push into Roman territory. These wars consumed most of the latter part of his reign, requiring Marcus to spend years in the field, directing operations from camps along the Danube rather than from the marble halls of Rome. He won victories, restored damaged frontier defenses, and even contemplated annexing new territory beyond the Danube, though he died before these plans could be realized. Marcus Aurelius is famed as a Stoic philosopher, and his private reflections, written during quiet moments in military camps, were later collected under the title Meditations. These writings express his beliefs in duty, rational self-control, acceptance of fate, and ethical service to humanity. They reveal a man struggling with the contradictions of his position, a philosopher who loved peace forced to wage war, a student of mortality surrounded by death. He wrote of the transience of all things, of emperors forgotten as surely as the humblest slaves, of the importance of doing one's duty regardless of whether anyone would remember or care. His philosophical reputation has endured through the centuries, making him perhaps the closest thing to a philosopher king the Western world has known. Building under Marcus focused less on monumental vanity than on practical needs. He repaired fortifications along the Danube, strengthened defenses against barbarian incursions, and funded projects in Rome and the provinces despite the financial strain of continuous warfare and the economic disruption caused by the plague. He sold imperial treasures to fund the wars rather than raise crushing taxes, a gesture that contemporary observers noted with admiration. The Column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, similar to Trajan's Column but depicting his own northern campaigns, was begun during his reign though completed after his death. In family terms, Marcus was adopted by Antoninus Pius and married Antoninus's daughter Faustina the Younger, a marriage that produced numerous children, most of whom died young. The one son who survived to adulthood was Commodus, and Marcus's decision to make Commodus his heir rather than adopting a more capable successor broke the adoptive tradition that had served the empire so well. It was the natural instinct of a father who had watched so many children die, yet it would prove to be his greatest failure. Marcus died of natural causes on campaign, having spent his final years far from the city he ruled. His meditations reveal a man who found little joy in power. He wrote of emperors past who were now forgotten, of the vanity of ambition, of the importance of accepting fate with equanimity. The Senate deified him after death, and his memory was honored by later generations as a model of what an emperor should be. Lucius Verus was born Lucius Sionius Commodus on the 15th of December in the year 130 AD. His father had been Hadrian's first choice as heir before dying unexpectedly. When Hadrian arranged for Antoninus to adopt both Marcus and Lucius, he ensured that both young men would share supreme power, creating formal co-emperorship. He died in early 169 AD, probably from sudden illness while returning from the front. His death came unexpectedly, and some sources suggest it may have been connected to the plague ravaging the empire. He was 38 years old, his reign cut short before he could establish a legacy beyond the Parthian War. Lucius Verus reigned jointly with Marcus Aurelius from 161 AD to 169 AD, sharing equal imperial titles though Marcus generally held higher prestige. The two had been raised together, and their partnership was closer to that of brothers than rivals. Marcus never sought to diminish Lucius or claim sole power. Lucius's main achievement was directing the Parthian War. When the Parthians attacked, Lucius traveled east, establishing headquarters at Antioch. He oversaw campaigns that reconquered Armenia and pushed into Mesopotamia, capturing Ctesiphon. The war restored Roman prestige and demonstrated the empire could still project power when challenged. The co-emperor's reign also saw the Antonine plague beginning among troops returning from Parthia. Millions died, cities were depopulated, and the state was severely damaged. Their partnership in managing this crisis demonstrated the value of shared rule. Ancient sources portray Lucius as more given to luxury than Marcus, enjoying games and pleasures while his colleagues spent hours on philosophy. Yet Marcus valued the partnership and insisted Lucius share power fully. Lucius's death, apparently sudden, left Marcus ruling alone. Despite criticism of his lifestyle, Lucius's leadership in the Eastern War helped secure Rome's frontier for a generation, and his partnership with Marcus demonstrated that two emperors could rule together without jealousy and murder. Commodus was born Lucius Aurelius Commodus on the 31st of August in the year 161 AD at Lanuvium, where his great-grandfather Antoninus Pius had also been born. He was a twin, though his brother Antoninus died in infancy, and he was the son of Marcus Aurelius and Faustina the Younger, making him the first biological son in this dynasty raised from childhood with the expectation that he would one day rule. This accident of birth changed everything, for Marcus chose to pass the throne to his own blood rather than adopt a more capable successor, as his predecessors had done. It was an understandable decision for a father, but it would prove disastrous for the empire. He died on the 31st of December in the year 192 AD, in Rome, assassinated in a conspiracy that involved members of his own household and court. The wrestler Narcissus, a professional athlete who served as Commodus's wrestling partner, strangled him in his bath after a poison administered earlier in the day failed to kill him quickly enough. He was 31 years old, and his death brought an end to the Nerva-Antonine line that had governed Rome for nearly a century. The dynasty that had given the empire 5 good emperors ended with one who would be remembered as among the worst. Commodus was made co-emperor with his father Marcus Aurelius in 177 AD, when he was still a teenager, and he assumed sole rule upon Marcus's death in 180 AD. His reign lasted about 12 years, during which the promise of the Golden Age built by his predecessors crumbled into chaos, corruption, and spectacle. Where Marcus had been devoted to duty and philosophy, Commodus showed little interest in the hard work of governing. Where his father had spent years on campaign defending the frontiers, Commodus preferred the pleasures of Rome. His reign is associated with political instability, increased court intrigue, and deterioration in military discipline. He delegated power to favorites and palace officials while focusing on personal image and entertainment. The freedman Seodorus, the prefect Perennis, and later the freedman Cleander each rose to dominate politics, only to fall spectacularly when they became too powerful. These men ruled in Commodus's name while the emperor indulged his passions. Commodus engaged in ambitious building and renaming projects that revealed the depths of his megalomania. He embellished Rome with monuments to himself, associated himself with Hercules, and renamed months, legions, the Senate, and even Rome itself after his titles. He appeared in public dressed as Hercules, carrying a club, wearing a lion's skin, demanding worship as a god while still living. Militarily, he inherited secure frontiers from Marcus Aurelius, but showed little interest in maintaining them through the hard work of campaigning. Rather than leading major operations himself, he left generals to manage conflicts on the borders while he remained in Rome. When problems arose, he sought compromise or payments rather than decisive military action. The peace his father had fought so hard to establish slowly eroded under this neglect, and the enemies who pressed against Rome's borders grew bolder as they sensed the weakening grip of imperial authority. Commodus's personal behavior was notorious even by the standards of an age that had seen Caligula and Nero. He appeared in the arena as a gladiator and beast killer, fighting from a protected position against animals and opponents who had been hobbled or disarmed to ensure his victory. He slaughtered ostriches and elephants, lions and bears, displaying a prowess that was entirely manufactured. He demanded enormous payments from the treasury for each of these appearances, treating the arena as both stage and source of income. The senators who were forced to attend and applaud these spectacles did so with hatred in their hearts, knowing that to show anything but enthusiasm might mean death. His extravagance and the power granted to favorites alienated many who might otherwise have supported the throne. Conspiracies arose repeatedly during his reign. His own sister Lucilla was involved in an early plot that failed, and she paid with her life. Others followed, each revealing the depth of opposition to his rule, each prompting purges that eliminated potential rivals but also capable administrators. The climate of fear that had characterized Domitian's final years returned under Commodus, as no one knew who might be next to face accusation and execution. The final conspiracy that ended his life involved his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Laetus, all people who had benefited from his favor, but who had come to fear that their names appeared on a list of those marked for death. On the last night of the year, they first tried poison, but when Commodus vomited up the dose, they sent in Narcissus to finish the job. The emperor died fighting, strangled by a man whose trade was violence. and his body was carried from the palace in secret. The Senate, meeting in hasty session, condemned his memory with unprecedented enthusiasm. They voted damnatio memoriae, ordering his name erased from monuments, his statues pulled down, his images destroyed. They called him a gladiator and a prostitute, hurling insults at the dead man that they had never dared whisper while he lived. His body was initially dumped without ceremony, though Pertinax, his immediate successor, later arranged a proper burial. The Nerva-Antonine dynasty ended in shame, murder, and the jubilant curses of senators who had spent 12 years living in fear. The murder of Commodus plunged the empire into chaos. With no clear heir, no designated successor, the throne was suddenly open to whoever could seize it. The year of the 5 emperors began, a repetition of the bloody events of 69 AD that had followed Nero's fall. For men would claim the purple in 193 AD before Septimius Severus finally established a new dynasty through military force. The century of good government that had begun with Nerva's quiet accession ended with Commodus's squalid death, and the empire entered a new and more turbulent era. Pertinax was born Publius Helvius Pertinax on the 1st of August in the year 126 AD, at Alba Pompeia in northern Italy. His father had been a former freedman, a man who had once been enslaved. This humble origin would have barred him from political advancement in an earlier age, but the empire had changed. He became a teacher, then a soldier, then an officer, climbing steadily through the hierarchy until he reached the Senate itself. He had served under Marcus Aurelius in the Northern Wars and earned a reputation for competence and integrity. He became emperor on the 1st of January in 193 AD, the day after Commodus's murder, when the Senate and Praetorian Guard accepted him as the respected senator most likely to restore stability. His elevation was swift and almost unanimous. The senators who had cowered before Commodus looked to Pertinax to restore their dignity. The soldiers hoped for a leader who would restore martial honor. Pertinax tried to reverse Commodus's excesses by enforcing strict discipline in the Praetorian Guard and cutting court expenses. He sold off the luxuries Commodus had accumulated, using the proceeds to fund government operations. He promised to rule with moderation and justice, to respect the Senate, and to avoid tyranny. These reforms pleased many, but quickly alienated soldiers accustomed to generous payments and lax discipline. His reign lasted only about 86 days, from January to March in 193 AD, making it one of the shortest in imperial history. It inaugurated what would be called the Year of the 5 Emperors, a period of civil war and chaos. In those brief months, Pertinax showed what might have been possible if he had been given time, but time was the one thing the empire would not grant him. Pertinax was killed on March 28th when mutinous Praetorians forced their way into the palace and stabbed him. He had tried to face them down, to remind them of their oaths, but they were beyond such appeals. They murdered him where he stood, and then wondered what they had done. The empire was theirs to sell. Later writers portrayed him as austere and well-intentioned, a man who might have restored the Golden Age if given the chance. But his inability to control the Praetorian Guard showed how fragile imperial authority had become. The soldiers who had once been instruments of imperial power had become its masters. Didius Julianus was born Marcus Didius Severus Julianus on the 29th of January in 133 AD in Mediolanum, which we now call Milan. His family was wealthy and prominent, with resources to launch him on a distinguished senatorial career. He served in various provinces, commanded troops, and accumulated the experience that should have qualified him for the highest office. He had governed Africa, commanded armies on the Danube, and held the consulship. But the manner of his accession would stain his reign forever. After Pertinax's murder, the Praetorian Guard found themselves in possession of the state, but uncertain what to do with it. They retreated to their camp and announced that the throne was available to whoever would pay the highest price. It was an act of stunning cynicism, reducing the majesty of Rome to a transaction. Two men came forward to bid: Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's father-in-law, and Didius Gellianus, who had more money and fewer scruples. Gellianus won by promising 25,000 sesterces to every soldier in the guard, a sum that would have bankrupted even his considerable fortune. The soldiers proclaimed him emperor and marched him to the Senate, which had no choice but to confirm what the swords had decided. His reign lasted only about 9 weeks, from late March to the 1st of June in 193 AD. It was plagued from the start by public outrage at his purchase of the empire and by rival imperial claims from provincial generals who commanded real armies rather than purchased ones. The people of Rome despised him. When he tried to address them from the forum, they shouted him down with insults, calling him a thief who had stolen what he could never deserve. Riots broke out in the streets, and Gellianus found himself a prisoner in his own palace, emperor in name but master of nothing beyond the walls. Major events of his brief rule included the rapid emergence of 3 powerful rivals who refused to accept the legitimacy of an emperor who had bought his throne. Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus in Pannonia each commanded legions that felt no loyalty to Gellianus. Of these 3, Severus moved fastest. He marched his legions toward Italy while Gellianus frantically tried to prepare defenses, recruit gladiators, and fortify the city against an attack that everyone knew was coming. His efforts were pathetic and futile, the actions of a man who had no idea how to fight a war. Gellianus's main scandal lay in the manner of his accession, widely condemned as corrupt and sacrilegious. He had reduced the sacred office of emperor to a commodity to be bought and sold. His inability to gain real control over the army and provinces made him appear weak and illegitimate, a paper emperor whose authority rested on nothing but a promise of cash that he would never be able to pay. The senators who had confirmed him did so under duress, and they waited eagerly for someone to deliver them from the embarrassment of his rule. On the 1st of June in 193 AD, the Senate, under pressure from Septimius Severus's advancing legions, declared Gellianus deposed and sentenced him to death. He was executed in the palace by a soldier sent for that purpose, bewildered to the end by how quickly his fortune had turned. He had ruled for 66 days, purchased an empire, and lost everything including his life. His death cleared the way for Severus to enter Rome unopposed, and a new dynasty began its rise. Septimius Severus was born Lucius Septimius Severus on the 11th of April in the year 145 AD at Leptis Magna in North Africa, a prosperous city on the Libyan coast. This made him the first Roman emperor from that region, another step in the broadening of the imperial elite that had begun with Trajan's Spanish origins. His family was wealthy and well-connected in provincial society, with ties to the equestrian order and to the emerging Romanized aristocracy of Africa. He grew up speaking both Latin and the Punic language of his ancestors, a man of 2 worlds who would one day rule them both. After Gellianus's discredited accession, Severus was proclaimed emperor by his Pannonian legions in April of 193 AD. He marched on Rome with speed and determination, having Gellianus killed upon his arrival, and then turned to deal with his remaining rivals. He neutralized Clodius Albinus by initially naming him Caesar, a promise of succession that kept Britain quiet while Severus dealt with the more immediate threat in the east. He then defeated Pescennius Niger in a series of battles across Asia Minor and Syria, culminating in Niger's death and the subjugation of his supporters. Only after the east was secure did Severus turn on Albinus, defeating him at the bloody Battle of Lugdunum in 197 AD and becoming undisputed master of the Roman world. His reign lasted from 193 to 211 AD, about 18 years in which he transformed imperial rule. He founded the Severan dynasty and reshaped government around military backing. the pretense of partnership with the Senate was abandoned. Severus ruled openly as a military autocrat, his power resting on the legions rather than the aristocracy. He rewarded soldiers who had made him emperor and punished opponents with confiscations and executions. Major events included victories over Niger in the east and campaigns in Mesopotamia against Parthia. He captured Ctesiphon and brought back spoils that funded his ambitions. Later, he led a campaign in Britain, strengthening Hadrian's Wall and attempting to pacify the northern tribes. It was in Britain that he would die. Severus greatly increased soldiers' pay and privileges. He allowed them to marry legally and settled veterans with generous grants. He relied heavily on the army, building a relationship between emperor and soldiers that his successors would continue. He promoted the Syrian cults associated with his wife Julia Domna, while remaining formally respectful of traditional Roman religion. Julia Domna was a remarkable woman, learned and ambitious, who would play a significant role in the politics of the Severan dynasty. She came from a priestly family in Emesa, Syria, and her influence brought Eastern religious practices and intellectuals to the imperial court. The empire was becoming more cosmopolitan, drawing talent and traditions from across its vast extent. Severus died on the 4th of February in the year 211 AD at Eboracum, which we now call York, in northern Britain. He had been ill for some time, his body worn out by decades of campaigning and the stresses of rule. Ancient sources report that his final advice to his sons Caracalla and Geta was to enrich the soldiers and despise all others, a phrase that later writers used to characterize his militarized regime. Whether he actually said these words or not, they captured the essence of his approach to power. He was deified after death, and his dynasty continued under his quarrelsome sons. Caracalla was born Lucius Septimius Bassianus on the 4th of April in 188 AD in Lugdunum. He was the elder son of Septimius Severus and Julia Domna, and he later took the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus to link himself to the revered Antonine dynasty. The nickname Caracalla came from a hooded cloak he favored. He grew up amid military camps, trained from childhood to inherit the throne. He became co-emperor with his father in 198 AD, and after Severus's death in 211, he ruled jointly with his younger brother Geta, a partnership that both men detested. The hatred between the brothers was legendary. Their mother Julia Domna tried desperately to reconcile them, but the enmity ran too deep. In December 211, Caracalla arranged for Geta to be killed during a supposed reconciliation meeting. Soldiers fell upon Geta and stabbed him to death in their mother's apartments. Ancient sources report he died in Julia Domna's arms, his blood staining her clothing, while Caracalla watched. She was forced to ally herself with the murderer to preserve what influence remained. Caracalla reigned as sole ruler from 211 to 217 AD. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, transforming the legal status of millions. Some sources suggest it was purely fiscal, expanding the tax base. Others see genuine belief in the unity of the Roman world. Whatever his motives, the decree changed what it meant to be Roman. In Rome, he sponsored the Baths of Caracalla, a monumental complex that covered vast acreage, containing bathing facilities, gymnasiums, libraries, and gardens. The ruins still stand today, a testament to the ambition of their builder. His reign was marked by brutality. After Geta's murder, he purged supporters with wholesale executions. Thousands died for having been loyal to the wrong prince. He cultivated a fierce, soldierly image, marching with troops and sharing their hardships. He admired Alexander the Great obsessively, visiting Alexander's tomb in Alexandria. He led campaigns against the Alemanni and conducted an inconclusive campaign against Parthia. In 217, marching between Edessa and Carrhae, he stopped to relieve himself by the roadside. A soldier named Martialis approached and stabbed him to death. Geta was born Publius Septimius Geta on March 7 in 189 AD, the younger son of Septimius Severus and Julia Domna. He grew up in his brother's shadow, always the second son. The brothers fought constantly, competing for their father's favor and nursing hatreds that would prove fatal. He was made Caesar in 198 and Augustus in 209, serving as co-emperor with his father and then with Caracalla. Severus had hoped shared power would teach his sons to cooperate, but he misunderstood the depth of their hatred. Every gesture and appointment became a battlefield in their endless war. The rivalry intensified after their father's death, with both trying to carve out separate spheres of influence. They divided the palace, posting guards to prevent attacks. Plans were discussed to divide the empire itself, with Caracalla ruling the west and Geta the east, but Julia Domna persuaded them to abandon this scheme. Geta's short co-emperorship saw no major independent policies. He shared formal authority but lacked Caracalla's control over key military units. In late 211, Caracalla arranged his murder during a supposed reconciliation meeting. Geta died in Julia Domna's arms at about 22 years old. His death was followed by a ruthless purge and damnatio memoriae. Geta's violent death ended the attempt at joint rule and contributed to the bloody reputation of the Severan dynasty. The family that had risen through military force would continue to fall by violence. Macrinus was born Marcus Opellius Macrinus around 165 AD in Mauritania. He came from an equestrian background rather than the senatorial families that had traditionally produced emperors. This made him the first emperor from the equestrian order, a man who had risen through ability rather than birth. His career had been in law and administration rather than the military, and this would prove his undoing when he needed soldiers' loyalty to survive. As Praetorian prefect under Caracalla, Macrinus is thought to have been involved in the plot that killed the emperor in 217 AD. Whether he ordered the assassination directly or merely knew it was coming and did nothing to prevent it, he was ready to seize power when Caracalla fell. The army, camped in the east and far from Rome, proclaimed Macrinus emperor, and the Senate had little choice but to confirm his accession. It was done, and a new man sat upon the throne, a man unlike any who had worn the purple before. His elevation broke a tradition that stretched back centuries. Macrinus was the first Roman emperor to come from the equestrian order rather than the senatorial aristocracy. He had not climbed the traditional ladder of offices that prepared men for supreme power. He had not commanded great armies or governed wealthy provinces as preparation for rule. He was an administrator, a lawyer, a man who understood contracts and procedures better than battles and sieges. His career had been built on competence rather than charisma, on efficiency rather than inspiration. He knew how to manage accounts and negotiate settlements, how to navigate the complex bureaucracy that kept the empire functioning, but he did not know how to inspire the love of fighting men or the awe of the Roman populace. This background would shape his reign and ultimately doom it. The soldiers who acclaimed him did so not from enthusiasm, but from necessity. Caracalla was dead, and someone had to wear the purple. Macrinus was present, he was competent, and he promised stability. But even as they raised him on their shields in the traditional gesture of imperial acclamation, many must have wondered whether this gray administrator could hold together an empire that demanded warriors and kings. Macrinus reigned from 217 to 218 AD, a little over a year during which he tried to reduce military expenditures by cutting some benefits and pay. These economies were necessary from a fiscal standpoint. Caracalla's wars had drained the treasury, and his lavish payments to soldiers had established expectations that could not be sustained indefinitely. But Macrinus's cuts quickly alienated many soldiers who had grown accustomed to the generous treatment they received under Severus and Caracalla. They had fought for years in the East, they were tired and far from home, and they expected rewards rather than reductions. Macrinus gave them neither victory nor money, and their loyalty began to waver like grass in an uncertain wind. The soldiers remembered Caracalla fondly despite his faults. He had marched with them, shared their hardships, rewarded their service with gold and privileges. He had been cruel and capricious, but he had been their kind of emperor, a man who valued military virtue above all else. Macrinus seemed a pale imitation, an office holder rather than a warrior, a man who counted coins when they wanted glory. The contrast was stark and damning, and the soldiers never stopped making it. Where Caracalla had led from the front, Macrinus commanded from the rear. Where Caracalla had shared the rough bread and thin wine of military rations, Macrinus maintained the dignified distance of an administrator. The soldiers noticed these differences and resented them. They began to speak of the old days under Severus and Caracalla as a golden age, forgetting the hardships and remembering only the rewards. In foreign policy, he inherited Caracalla's Eastern War against Parthia. After initial fighting, he negotiated peace on rather costly terms, paying indemnities to avoid further conflict. Some criticized this settlement as un-Roman, a shameful retreat from the aggressive stance that Caracalla had taken. The great king of Parthia received gold that might have gone to Roman soldiers, and the army that had expected triumph received only the order to march home. Others saw the peace as prudent, a recognition that the army was exhausted and that prolonging the war would only increase the danger. But prudence is rarely popular with soldiers who measure their worth in victories, and Macrinus's reputation suffered accordingly. He never traveled to Rome during his brief reign. The capital that had been the heart of the empire for centuries never saw its emperor in person. Macrinus remained in the east, managing affairs from Antioch and other provincial cities, always intending to make the journey west, but never quite finding the right moment. The Eastern wars demanded attention, the treasury needed management, and the distance seemed too great to risk while enemies both foreign and domestic remained unsubdued. This absence bred uncertainty and rumors in the capital. The senators who might have supported him had no opportunity to take his measure in person, to assess his character, to build the personal relationships that oiled the machinery of Roman politics. The people of Rome knew their emperor only through coins and proclamations, through reports that filtered slowly westward, through the gossip of travelers and merchants who claimed to have seen him in some distant city. Rome had grown accustomed to emperors who made their presence felt in the capital. Even those who campaigned frequently, like Marcus Aurelius and Septimius Severus, had returned periodically to tend the fires of popular loyalty. Macrinus's continued absence suggested either weakness or indifference, neither of which endeared him to those whose support he needed. His position weakened dramatically when Julia Maesa, the sister of Julia Domna, began promoting her grandson Elagabalus as a true Severan heir in Syria. Maesa was a formidable woman, as ambitious as her sister had been, and she understood the power of dynasty in Roman politics. She had been exiled from court after Caracalla's death, forced to return to her hometown of Emesa, and she burned with resentment at her diminished status. She spread rumors that Elagabalus was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son, a claim that may or may not have been true, but that gave the boy a connection to the murdered emperor that Macrinus could not match. The Eastern legions, already unhappy with Macrinus's economies and his less than glorious peace, began to turn toward this young claimant who promised to restore the Severan Golden Age. Gold flowed from Maesa's coffers to the soldiers' hands, and with each coin came whispers of a return to the generosity of Caracalla. The priests of Emesa displayed the boy in his sacred vestments, and soldiers saw in him the blood of the dynasty they had served for a generation. Macrinus tried to counter these moves, but lacked the resources and the charisma to compete. He raised his son Diademenianus to the rank of Caesar and then Augustus, hoping to establish his own dynasty, but the gesture rang hollow. His son was young and unknown, without the mystique of Severan blood. The soldiers who might have rallied to defend an established line had no particular reason to fight for a family that had ruled for less than 2 years. The decisive confrontation came near Antioch in June of 218 AD. The two armies met on a plain outside the city, and at first Macrinus's forces seemed to have the advantage. But as the battle developed, his troops began deserting to the enemy even as he tried to rally them. They crossed the lines singly and in groups, drawn by promises of restored pay and by the presence of Caracalla's supposed son. The trickle became a flood, and suddenly Macrinus found himself nearly alone on a battlefield that had turned against him. He fled westward, hoping perhaps to reach Rome and rally support, but his flight was disorganized and desperate. He shed the symbols of imperial rank, disguised himself as a common traveler, and tried to disappear into the anonymous crowds that thronged the roads of Asia Minor. But an emperor cannot simply vanish. Word spread of his route, and pursuit followed close behind. He was captured in Chalcedon, just across the strait from Byzantium, betrayed by those who hoped to curry favor with the new regime. His brief outsider regime ended without establishing a new dynasty, without leaving any lasting mark on the empire he had briefly ruled. His son Diademenianus was hunted down and killed shortly after, and the Severan women returned to power through the boy priest Elagabalus. The empire passed to a teenage priest whose reign would become one of the most bizarre in Roman history. The fall of Macrinus illustrated harsh truths about imperial power in the 3rd century. Military loyalty was the foundation of everything, and that loyalty could not be purchased with promises of fiscal responsibility or efficient administration. The soldiers wanted an emperor who looked like an emperor, who rewarded them generously, who led them to victory or at least maintained the appearance of martial vigor. Macrinus offered none of these things, and for all his administrative competence, he could not survive the loss of military confidence. His reign also demonstrated how powerful the idea of dynasty had become. The Severan name carried weight that no newcomer could match. Julia Maesa understood this, and she used it ruthlessly to destroy a man who had done nothing to her personally, but who stood between her family and power. The blood of Septimius Severus, real or invented, proved more valuable than any qualification or achievement that Macrinus could claim. And so Macrinus passed from the stage of history, a footnote in the Chronicle of Emperors, remembered mainly for being the first of equestrian rank and for losing to a teenage priest. His body was left unburied or disposed of without ceremony, and no one mourned his passing except perhaps his young son, who followed him shortly into death. The empire continued on its restless course, always searching for stability, always finding only the next crisis. Elagabalus, officially known as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus after his supposed father Caracalla, was born Varius Avitus Bassianus around the year 204 AD in Emesa, a city in Syria that had long been a center of religious devotion and priestly tradition. His family were hereditary priests of the sun god Elagabal, a deity whose worship centered on a sacred black stone that had fallen from the heavens in ages past. This meteorite, smooth and conical and black as the night sky from which it had fallen, was believed to be the physical embodiment of the solar deity, a piece of heaven itself come to rest among mortals. The young Varius grew up serving this god, learning the rituals and dances, wearing the exotic vestments of a Syrian priest, never dreaming that such strange customs would one day scandalize Rome. His grandmother Julia Maesa was the sister of Julia Domna, the powerful wife of Septimius Severus, and when Caracalla died and Macrinus proved unpopular, Maesa saw her opportunity. She had been forced into exile after Caracalla's death, stripped of the influence she had enjoyed at court, and she burned to restore her family to power. The boy Elagabalus became her instrument. She spread the rumor that he was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son, pointing to a certain physical resemblance that may or may not have been genuine. The soldiers, already unhappy with Macrinus, chose to believe the story because believing it served their interests, and the priests of Emesa produced their young charge in all his sacred finery to claim the throne. The rebellion began in May of 218 AD, when the soldiers of the 3rd Gallic Legion stationed near Emesa proclaimed the boy emperor. Julia Misa had distributed gold liberally among the troops, and her promises of restored pay and privileges proved more persuasive than Macrinus's austerity measures. The priests displayed Elagabalus in his exotic vestments, and the soldiers saw in him the blood of Caracalla, the spirit of Severus, the restoration of a dynasty they had loved. Whether any of this was true mattered less than whether they believed it, and believe it they did. Backed by his grandmother Julia Misa and the Syrian legions, Elagabalus was proclaimed emperor in 218 AD at the age of 14. The claim of Severan blood gave him legitimacy that Macrinus could not match, and the gold that Misa distributed ensured that legitimacy was well armed. After defeating Macrinus in battle, the teenage emperor entered Rome as the ruler of the known world, bringing with him the sacred black stone of Emesa and a determination to elevate his god above all others. His journey from Syria to Rome was itself a spectacle that alarmed traditionalists who heard the reports. The young emperor traveled slowly, stopping at cities along the way to perform the rituals of his cult, dancing before the sacred stone in a manner that seemed bizarre to Roman sensibilities. He wore the long robes of an Eastern priest rather than the military cloak of a Roman commander, and his face was painted in the manner customary among the priests of Elagabal. These were not the trappings of a Roman emperor, and those who had hoped for a restoration of Severan normalcy began to have doubts. Elagabalus reigned from 218 to 222 AD, and his rule became infamous for religious innovations that shocked the Roman establishment to its core. He elevated the Syrian sun god Elagabal above Jupiter himself, placing a foreign deity at the head of the Roman pantheon that had existed for centuries. This was not merely personal devotion, but a matter of state policy. He built a grand temple called the Elagabalium on the Palatine Hill, the Sacred Heart of Rome itself, to house the black stone he had brought from Emesa. The temple was magnificent, adorned with gold and precious stones, and into it went not only the sacred meteorite, but also other objects sacred to the Roman state. He brought the Palladium from the Temple of Vesta, an ancient image said to have been brought from Troy by Aeneas himself, and upon which the safety of Rome itself was believed to depend since the founding of the city. He brought sacred objects from other temples as well, gathering the holy things of Rome into his new temple, as if to demonstrate that all divine power now flowed through his Syrian god. The priests of the old cults watched in horror as their traditions were subverted, their temples stripped of their most precious relics, their gods subordinated to a foreign deity they did not understand. His religious policies included public ceremonies where he sacrificed cattle and sheep in prodigious numbers, pouring wine and blood over the altars of his god. These sacrifices were accompanied by dancing and music in the Syrian style, with drums and cymbals and flutes creating sounds that seemed cacophonous to Roman ears accustomed to more solemn rituals. The emperor himself participated in these ceremonies with an enthusiasm that many found undignified, dancing ecstatically before the sacred stone, his body swaying to rhythms that had no precedent in Roman tradition. He led processions through the streets of Rome with the meteorite carried on a chariot drawn by white horses while he walked backward before it, so that he would never turn his back on his god. These processions became regular features of Roman life during his reign. The streets would be cleared, incense would be burned, and the emperor would appear in his priestly vestments to honor his deity. Citizens lined the routes, some drawn by curiosity, others by genuine religious interest, still others by the coins and food that were distributed during these festivals. The spectacle was impressive in its way, but it troubled those who remembered how Roman emperors had traditionally appeared before their people, in military dress or the toga of a citizen, not in the flowing robes and painted face of an Eastern priest. He attempted to merge Elagabal with other major deities, declaring that all gods were merely aspects of the one supreme solar divinity he served. Jupiter and Mars and Apollo were not separate beings, but manifestations of Elagabal, shadows cast by the one true source of divine light. This theological innovation might have been philosophically sophisticated in some contexts, but to traditional Romans it seemed like an assault on their ancestors and their gods. The great deities who had guided Rome to dominion over the world were being reduced to mere emanations of Assyrian stone. He even tried to marry his god to the goddess Vesta, staging an elaborate ceremony in which the sacred flame of Vesta was symbolically united with the black stone of Elagabal. The Vestal Virgins, those sacred women who had tended the eternal flame for centuries, found themselves incorporated into rituals that made a mockery of their traditions. Some ancient sources claim he also took a Vestal as his own wife, violating one of the most sacred taboos in Roman religion. Vestals were sworn to chastity for 30 years of service, and for an emperor to break that vow by force or persuasion was an act of sacrilege that many found unforgivable. The temple atop the Palatine became the center of a cult that drew worshippers from across the empire, people curious about this strange new religion that their emperor promoted with such fervor. The black stone was displayed for veneration, and pilgrims came to gaze upon the object that had fallen from the heavens in ages beyond memory. Syrian priests chanted prayers in languages the Romans did not understand, and incense filled the air with unfamiliar scents of myrrh and exotic spices. It was as if a piece of the East had been transplanted into the heart of the West, and not everyone welcomed the change. The temple complex grew to include not only the sanctuary of Elagabal, but also gardens, baths, and accommodations for the many priests who served the cult. Elagabalus brought Syrian priests to Rome in great numbers, men who knew the rituals and mysteries of his ancestral religion, who could perform the ceremonies properly and train others in the ways of the sun god. These priests became a visible presence in the capital, their foreign dress and foreign ways a constant reminder that Rome was now ruled by an emperor who looked eastward for his inspiration. The emperor also established festivals in honor of his god that were added to the Roman calendar. These celebrations featured games and spectacles, distributions of food and money, the kind of public entertainments that Romans had always loved. But they were dedicated not to Jupiter or Mars but to Elagabal, and the symbolism was clear to all who had eyes to see. The old order was passing away, replaced by something new and strange. Romans who had worshipped Jupiter and Mars for centuries found themselves ruled by a boy who seemed to care nothing for the old gods, who danced before a stone from Syria while neglecting the traditions that had made Rome great. The Senate, that ancient body that prided itself on maintaining Roman traditions through all the changes of empire, watched helplessly as their religious heritage was transformed into something they barely recognized. Some consoled themselves with the thought that the boy was young and might yet learn Roman ways, might yet put aside the peculiarities of his Syrian upbringing and embrace the gods of his imperial predecessors. Others suspected that Julia Maesa, the real power behind the throne, would eventually reign in her grandson's excesses. But as the months passed and the innovations continued, as new temples rose and old traditions faded, hope began to fade along with them. The empire that had conquered the world was being transformed by a teenager who danced for a stone. Beyond his religious innovations, Elagabalus's personal life was marked by scandals that ancient sources describe with equal parts horror and fascination. He married multiple times during his brief reign, working through a succession of wives with bewildering speed that made a mockery of the institution of Roman marriage. His first wife was Julia Cornelia Paula, a woman of noble birth who seemed a suitable match for an emperor, a union that promised to bring stability and perhaps an heir to secure the dynasty. But he divorced her within a year, apparently dissatisfied for reasons the sources do not fully explain, and moved on to the next. Each marriage seemed less about establishing a dynasty than about satisfying some restless impulse that drove the young emperor from one union to another, never content, always seeking something he could not name. The pattern of his marriages troubled those who hoped the young emperor would settle into the responsibilities of his office. Roman aristocratic families offered their daughters as potential empresses, only to see them elevated and then cast aside in rapid succession. The disgrace of divorce touched not only the women but their entire families, who had invested hope and resources in what proved to be ephemeral connections to power. His marriage to the Vestal virgin Aquilia Severa was the most shocking of these unions. Vestals were sworn to chastity for 30 years of service, their virginity considered essential to the safety and prosperity of the Roman state. The eternal flame they tended in the Temple of Vesta was a symbol of Rome's perpetual existence, and for that flame to be polluted by unchastity was considered a terrible omen. For an emperor to marry a Vestal, to take for himself a woman consecrated to a goddess, was an act of sacrilege that many found unforgivable. Elagabalus reportedly defended the marriage by claiming that the union of himself, as high priest of Elagabal, with a priestess of Vesta would produce godlike children. The logic was circular and the theology dubious, but the marriage went forward regardless of what anyone else thought. He divorced Aquilia and married another woman, then returned to Aquilia again, cycling through unions with a disregard for convention that left traditionalists speechless. Roman marriage was serious business involving property, inheritance, and social status, and the emperor was treating it like a game. Each new wife brought a period of favor for her family, followed by disgrace when the divorce came. The women themselves were pawns in whatever drama was playing out in the emperor's mind. His court became notorious for the influence of favorites who rose to power through the emperor's affection. He openly favored male companions at court, elevating a charioteer named Hierocles to extraordinary influence and reportedly referring to him as husband. Ancient sources, hostile as they are, paint a picture of a court where traditional boundaries of behavior were deliberately transgressed. Hierocles was said to exercise power over the emperor himself, and others sought to gain similar influence through similar means. The power dynamics at court became entangled with personal relationships in ways that scandalized observers. Another favorite was a slave named Zodicus, an athlete known for his physical attributes, who was brought to the palace and elevated to positions far above his station. The rivalry between Hierocles and Zodicus and others for the emperor's favor created factions within the court, each trying to outmaneuver the others, each rising and falling with the emperor's shifting affections. This was not how Roman politics was supposed to work. Influence was meant to flow through the Senate, through the military, through the established channels of power, not through the bedroom of a teenage emperor. The ancient sources describe a court of wild parties, exotic entertainments, and expenses that strained even the imperial treasury. Elagabalus reportedly served meals on silver plates so valuable that each could have fed a working family for years, used only gold chamber pots as if even his waste was too precious for common vessels, and showered his favorites with gifts that would have made earlier emperors blush with their extravagance. He was said to have released thousands of vipers during a festival, causing panic among the crowd as the serpents slithered through the terrified spectators. He was said to have suffocated guests at banquets beneath showers of rose petals, burying them in fragrant death. How much of this is true, and how much is hostile invention created by later writers who despised his memory, we cannot know with certainty. But the image of excess was clearly part of how his contemporaries and later generations remembered his reign. Even if only half the stories were true, his court was a spectacle of waste and indulgence that Rome had rarely seen. The sources also describe elaborate pranks and humiliations inflicted on guests and courtiers. He supposedly served meals of glass food that could not be eaten, of painted stones that looked like delicacies but shattered teeth. He assigned guests to seats based on their physical attributes, grouping the bald together, the fat together, the tall together, turning his banquets into exercises in mockery. Whether these stories are true or invented, they painted a picture of an emperor who found amusement in the discomfort of others. His treatment of the Senate was contemptuous in ways that went beyond even the worst excesses of emperors like Caligula and Nero. He reportedly placed his grandmother Julia Maesa in the Senate chamber itself, an unprecedented breach of tradition that allowed a woman to participate in senatorial deliberations. He appointed favorites to positions they were entirely unqualified to hold, selecting officials based on the size of certain physical attributes rather than their administrative abilities. The machinery of government continued to function, more or less, thanks to the efforts of Julia Maesa and experienced administrators, but the emperor himself seemed entirely indifferent to the responsibilities of his office. Growing discontent in the Praetorian Guard and among political leaders led Julia Maesa to hedge her bets by supporting Elagabalus's younger cousin Alexander as an alternative. Maesa was no fool. She understood that her grandson was destroying himself, that his behavior had made him too many enemies, and that the dynasty could only survive if power passed to someone more acceptable before the inevitable catastrophe occurred. She persuaded Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his heir and Caesar, a decision the young emperor came to regret when it became clear that Alexander was winning the loyalty that Elagabalus had squandered. The two cousins became rivals in a court that could barely contain them both. Elagabalus reportedly attempted several times to have Alexander killed, ordering assassinations that were prevented by the vigilance of Maesa and the Praetorian Guard. The soldiers had come to prefer the younger cousin, who seemed more stable, more Roman, more likely to restore normalcy after the chaos of Elagabalus's reign. Each assassination attempt that failed strengthened Alexander's position and weakened Elagabalus's. In March of 222 AD, the crisis came to a head. Elagabalus spread rumors that Alexander was dying, hoping to provoke the soldiers into accepting his cousin's removal from the succession. But the Praetorians demanded to see Alexander in person, and when both cousins appeared before them, the soldiers made their preference clear. They cheered for Alexander and ignored Elagabalus. The emperor, in a fit of rage, ordered the execution of those who had cheered for his rival. It was his last mistake. The guard murdered Elagabalus and his mother Julia Soaemias in a barracks coup on March 11th of that year. The soldiers, disgusted by the emperor's behavior and fearful that he planned to eliminate Alexander, struck without warning or mercy. Mother and son were killed together, their bodies dragged through the streets of Rome, mutilated by the mob, and thrown into the Tiber like common criminals. The great sewer that ran beneath the city, the Cloaca Maxima, carried their remains toward the sea. Elagabalus was 18 years old. His memory was condemned by decree of the Senate with an enthusiasm that spoke to the depths of the hatred he had inspired. His name was erased from inscriptions throughout the empire, a process called damnatio memoriae that was meant to erase a person from history itself. His statues were pulled down and destroyed, his images scratched from paintings and mosaics. His reign declared a stain upon Roman history that should be forgotten. The black stone was sent back to Emesa, returning the sacred meteorite to the temple where it had been worshipped for centuries before Elagabalus brought it to Rome. The Elagabalium on the Palatine, that grand temple he had built to house his god, was rededicated to other gods and purged of its Syrian associations. The priests were sent home, the rituals were ended, the exotic vestments were put away. It was as if the empire was trying to forget that the past 4 years had ever happened, wiping clean a memory too shameful to preserve. And yet the memory persisted. Later historians recorded the scandals in lurid detail, passing down stories that may have grown with each retelling. Elagabalus became a byword for excess and depravity, his name invoked whenever writers wished to illustrate the depths to which imperial power could fall. Whether the real boy behind the legends was quite as monstrous as the sources suggest, we will never know. What is certain is that his reign represented a crisis in Roman identity, a moment when foreign customs and religious innovations seemed to threaten everything that made Rome Roman. Severus Alexander was born Marcus Julius Gessius Alexianus on the 1st of October in the year 208 AD at Arca Caesarea in Phoenicia, a region that lay along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea where ancient cities looked out toward the endless blue waters. He was a relative of the powerful Severan women Julia Maesa and Julia Mamaea, connected to the dynasty through blood and marriage, carrying in his veins the heritage that had made the Severans masters of the Roman world. He had grown up in the shadow of his older cousin Elagabalus, watching as that young man's excesses brought him ever closer to destruction. He learned caution from his cousin's recklessness, learning what not to do from someone who seemed determined to do everything wrong. When destruction came for Elagabalus, Alexander was ready to step into his place. The contrast between the two cousins could hardly have been more stark. Where Elagabalus had been wild and impulsive, Alexander appeared steady and thoughtful. Where Elagabalus had devoted himself to foreign gods and exotic rituals, Alexander seemed content with traditional Roman worship. Where Elagabalus had scandalized Rome with his behavior, Alexander cultivated an image of modesty and restraint. These differences were not accidental. Julia Mamaea had carefully shaped her son to be everything that Elagabalus was not, understanding that the dynasty could only survive if the next emperor repaired the damage caused by the previous one. His mother Julia Mamaea had been preparing him for this moment for years, raising him to be a proper Roman emperor in the mold of the Antonines rather than in the image of his scandalous cousin. Where Elagabalus was erratic, Alexander was steady. Where Elagabalus flouted tradition, Alexander respected it. Where Elagabalus alienated the Senate and the army, Alexander would work to reconcile both. Julia Mamaea was a formidable woman in her own right, intelligent and ambitious, determined to see her son succeed where her nephew had failed. She would be the guiding force of his reign, for better and for worse. Elevated by the Praetorian Guard after Elagabalus's murder in 222 AD, Alexander was adopted as son and successor shortly before the coup itself, giving a veneer of dynastic continuity to what was essentially a palace revolution. The transition was bloody but swift, and within days Alexander was sole emperor, guided by his mother Julia Mamaea and a council of advisors who sought to repair the damage done by the previous reign. He was 14 years old, the same age Elagabalus had been when he came to power, but the parallels ended there. Alexander promised normalcy, stability, a return to Roman values after years of scandal and innovation. Severus Alexander reigned from 222 to 235 AD, about 13 years during which much of the real power was exercised by his mother Julia Mamaea and experienced advisors who understood how to govern an empire. They emphasized legal order, returning to the principles that had guided the better emperors of earlier generations. They emphasized financial prudence, ending the wild expenditures that had drained the treasury under Elagabalus and Caracalla. They emphasized cooperation with the Senate, treating that ancient body with the respect it craved after years of contempt and humiliation. It was a dramatic contrast to the chaos that had characterized his cousin's rule, a deliberate turning away from everything that had made Elagabalus infamous. The great jurist Ulpian served as Praetorian prefect for a time, bringing his expertise in law to the highest levels of government. Ulpian was one of the most brilliant legal minds of his age, a man whose writings on Roman law would be quoted for centuries after his death. His presence at court signaled that the new regime would govern by law rather than whim, by precedent rather than caprice. Legal scholars and administrators were welcomed where favorites and charlatans had held sway before. It was a period of attempted reform, of trying to restore stability to an empire that had been shaken by years of excess and misrule. The treasury was replenished through careful management and reduced spending. The army was maintained but not indulged with the endless gifts and privileges that had become expected under the earlier sovereigns. The provinces were governed with attention to justice and efficiency. To many it seemed like a new golden age was beginning, a return to the good governance that had characterized the Antonine dynasty. His religious policy was notably tolerant compared to that of his predecessor. Alexander honored the traditional Roman gods, restoring the temples and rituals that Elagabalus had neglected or subverted, giving Jupiter and Mars and the other deities of Rome their proper place in the official religion of the state. But he also allowed a variety of cults to flourish throughout the empire, recognizing that the diverse peoples under Roman rule worshipped in diverse ways. He reportedly kept statues of various religious figures in his private chapel, including Christ and Abraham alongside deities from Roman and Greek tradition, a remarkable collection that reflected the diverse religious landscape of the 3rd century empire. This eclectic approach to religion was characteristic of the age, a time when the old certainties were fading and new ideas were spreading across the empire with unprecedented speed. Christianity was growing throughout the empire, spreading through cities and along trade routes, winning converts from all levels of society with its message of salvation and eternal life. Eastern cults from Persia and Egypt and Syria competed for followers with traditional Roman worship, offering mysteries and revelations that the old gods had never promised. Philosophy offered its own path to spiritual meaning for those inclined to intellectual religion, with Stoicism and Neoplatonism providing frameworks for understanding the cosmos and one's place within it. Alexander seemed content to let all these traditions coexist, intervening only when religious conflict threatened public order. This tolerance was notable in an age when religious differences could lead to violence and persecution, and it marked his reign as a period of relative peace between the diverse faiths that shared the empire. The emperor himself was said to begin each day with private devotions in his chapel, honoring the various deities and sages whose images he had collected there. This personal piety coexisted with his public role as Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Roman state religion, a combination that later Christian writers would find noteworthy and that illustrated the complex religious landscape of the 3rd century. The court around Alexander was dominated by women to a degree unusual in Roman history. Julia Mamaea exercised enormous influence over her son, making decisions in his name, receiving embassies, directing policy. Julia Maesa, until her death around 224 or 225 AD, remained a powerful presence as well, the grandmother who had engineered 2 imperial successions and who understood better than anyone the dynamics of sovereign power. Some ancient sources present this female influence as problematic, suggesting that Alexander was weak and controlled by his mother. Others suggest that Julia Mamaea was a wise counselor whose guidance helped her son avoid the disasters that had befallen Elagabalus. The administration of the empire continued to function effectively under this regime, the wheels of bureaucracy turning as they had for generations. Governors were appointed on the basis of competence rather than favoritism, chosen for their ability to manage provinces rather than their connections at court. Legal reforms strengthened the rights of citizens and provided mechanisms for addressing grievances against officials who abused their power. Building projects improved infrastructure throughout the provinces, repairing roads and aqueducts that had been neglected during the recent troubles. The currency was stabilized after years of debasement that had undermined confidence in Roman money. For those who remembered the chaos of the Year of the 5 Emperors or the scandals of Elagabalus, the reign of Severus Alexander must have seemed like a restoration of sanity, a return to the orderly governance that had characterized Rome at its best. Yet there were also challenges that the new emperor and his advisors struggled to address, problems that no amount of good governance could easily solve. The army, which had become accustomed to the lavish treatment it received under Septimius Severus and Caracalla, chafed under the new austerity that fiscal responsibility demanded. Soldiers who expected generous donatives received instead lectures about fiscal responsibility and the need for restraint. They had grown used to being the pampered favorites of the state, and they did not appreciate being told that the treasury could not afford their expectations. The Praetorian Guard, always dangerous when dissatisfied, grew restless in their barracks near the capital. They had murdered one emperor already, and they would not hesitate to murder another if he ceased to please them. Ulpian himself was murdered by guardsmen in 228 AD, killed despite the emperor's attempts to protect him, struck down in the palace itself by soldiers who resented his discipline and his reforms. It was a stark reminder that even the wisest policies could not always control the violence that lurked at the heart of Roman power. The man who had tried to govern by law died by the sword, and the young emperor learned that reason and justice were weak reeds when set against armed discontent. The reign that had begun with such promise would face increasing difficulties as the years passed and enemies both foreign and domestic grew bolder. The major events of Severus Alexander's reign included conflict with a new and dangerous enemy in the east, one that would threaten Rome for centuries to come and would ultimately play a role in reshaping the entire ancient world. The Sasanian Persian Empire had risen to power around 224 AD, when a dynasty of aggressive rulers overthrew the Parthian kingdom that had long been Rome's eastern neighbor and frequent adversary. The Parthians had been formidable opponents in their time, capable of inflicting devastating defeats on Roman armies, as they had done to Crassus at Carrhae and to other commanders who underestimated them. But their decentralized political structure and periodic civil wars had limited their ability to wage sustained campaigns against Rome, and the two empires had reached a kind of equilibrium along the Euphrates. The Sasanians were different. They were more centralized, more militaristic, more ideologically driven than their predecessors had been. They brought a new energy and ambition to the ancient rivalry between East and West. The Sasanian king Ardashir I, the founder of the new dynasty, began pressing against Rome's eastern frontiers soon after consolidating his power. He styled himself the King of Kings, using the ancient title that had belonged to Cyrus and Darius and the other great rulers of Persian antiquity. He claimed to be the heir of their empire, and he dreamed of restoring Persian rule over all the lands their ancestors had once governed, lands that now belonged to Rome. He raided into Mesopotamia, the rich territory between the Tigris and Euphrates that had been contested between Rome and Persia for generations, striking at cities and fortresses that had been Roman for centuries. He threatened the great fortress city of Hatra, which had withstood Roman sieges, but now faced a new and more determined enemy. He proclaimed his intention to recover all the lands that had once belonged to Persia, which by his reckoning included much of Rome's eastern provinces, including Syria and Egypt and Asia Minor itself. This was not mere raiding for plunder, but a strategic challenge to Roman dominance in the region, a declaration of intent that Rome could not ignore. Alexander led campaigns to meet this threat, gathering armies and marching eastward to confront the Persian king with the full might of Rome. The sources are unclear about exactly what happened during these campaigns, with some ancient writers claiming Roman victories and others acknowledging setbacks and failures that the official accounts tried to minimize. What seems certain is that Alexander achieved modest successes, but failed to inflict decisive defeat on the Persian king. The Eastern Front remained contested, neither side able to establish clear dominance, the boundary between empires shifting with the fortunes of war. The campaigns drained resources and attention from other pressing problems, keeping the emperor and his best troops occupied in distant lands while troubles multiplied elsewhere. The Roman army that fought in the east was not what it had once been in the days of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. Years of civil war, plague, and political turmoil had taken their toll on military effectiveness. Many experienced soldiers had died in the succession conflicts that followed Commodus's fall. The generous pay and privileges granted by Septimius Severus had attracted recruits, but had also created expectations that were difficult to maintain. Discipline had suffered as soldiers learned they could murder emperors with impunity. The army that Alexander led eastward was still formidable by the standards of the ancient world, but it was not the unstoppable force that had conquered the Mediterranean under earlier generations. The Sasanians, by contrast, were rising to the height of their power. Their heavy cavalry, armored from head to toe and mounted on armored horses, was a terror on the battlefield. Their archers could loose clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. Their military leadership was competent and aggressive, eager to test themselves against the Romans who had for so long dominated the region. The clash between these two powers would continue for centuries, until the Arab conquests finally swept both empires from the pages of history. Serious pressure also mounted on the Rhine frontier from Germanic groups who sensed opportunity in Rome's troubles and smelled weakness in the wind. The Alemanni, a confederation of tribes that had formed along the Upper Rhine during the preceding decades, began raiding across the river into Roman territory with increasing boldness. Other groups joined them, testing defenses that had been weakened by decades of civil war and the diversion of troops to eastern commitments. These were not the disciplined invasions of a unified enemy, but rather opportunistic raids by groups seeking plunder and land, war bands of young warriors eager to win glory and wealth at Rome's expense. Yet their cumulative effect was devastating to the provinces they struck, leaving burned villages, slaughtered civilians, and abandoned farms in their wake. The countryside along the Rhine had been peaceful for generations, its inhabitants growing accustomed to the security that Roman power provided. Now that security was crumbling. Farmers who had cultivated their fields without fear found themselves fleeing before barbarian raiders. Towns that had never needed walls suddenly discovered how vulnerable they were. The comfortable assumption that Rome would always protect its own was being shattered with each new incursion across the river. The army needed to respond with force to these incursions, to punish the raiders and deter future attacks, to reassert Roman dominance over frontiers that had been quiet for so long. But Alexander and his advisors preferred negotiation and payments over decisive battle, hoping to buy peace rather than fight for it. They offered tribute to tribal leaders, hoping that gold would accomplish what swords might fail to achieve. It was a policy with precedent. The empire had often purchased the goodwill of frontier peoples when military options seemed too costly or uncertain, and sometimes such arrangements had preserved peace for years or even decades. But this policy angered many soldiers who expected bold military leadership and spoils rather than diplomacy and restraint. They had not joined the legions to watch their emperor bargain with barbarians, to see Roman gold flowing into the hands of enemies who should have been crushed on the battlefield. They wanted to march against the enemy, to win glory and plunder as their predecessors had done in the days when Rome's armies swept all before them. They wanted an emperor who would lead them into battle with sword in hand, not one who sent ambassadors with bags of gold. They looked at Alexander and saw not a warrior but a diplomat, not a commander but a negotiator. The contrast with emperors like Trajan and Septimius Severus, who had personally led armies to victory after victory, was unflattering to the young man who seemed to prefer his mother's counsel to the advice of his generals and who appeared to find the bloodshed of battle distasteful. Julia Mamaea's influence over her son became a source of resentment among the troops, a grievance that grew with each passing month. They called him mother's boy and worse, questioning whether he had the strength and resolve to lead them. wondering whether he would ever grow into the role of warrior emperor that Roman tradition demanded. They noted that Julia Mamaea accompanied the army on campaign, traveling with her son even to the frontiers, and they found this inappropriate for an emperor who should have been free to focus on military matters without maternal interference. They whispered that she made decisions for him, that he could not act without her approval, that he was emperor in name but child in truth. Whether their criticism was fair or not, it reflected a growing disenchantment with a regime that seemed more interested in restraint than in action, more comfortable with negotiation than with war. The soldiers had seen how power worked in Rome during the turbulent decades they had lived through. They had elevated emperors and destroyed them with equal facility. They had sold the throne to Didius Julianus and then taken it away again when a better offer came along. They had murdered Pertinax for trying to impose discipline, murdered Caracalla by the roadside, murdered Elagabalus in his own palace. They understood that the purple was won and kept by force, not by virtue or wisdom or good intentions. An emperor who could not or would not fight was an emperor who would not last. The legions began to murmur their discontent in the camps and along the frontier roads, and ambitious men began to listen to what they were saying. Among those who listened most carefully was Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, called Maximinus Thrax for his Thracian origin, a soldier of obscure birth who had risen through the ranks to command respect among the troops. He was a giant of a man by the standards of his age, towering over other soldiers, renowned for his physical strength and his skill with weapons. He had none of the refinement or education that characterized the aristocratic emperors of the past, but he understood soldiers in a way that Alexander never had, and he knew how to channel their frustrations toward his own ends. He had risen from common soldier to officer to general through ability and determination, and he saw no reason why his rise should stop short of the ultimate prize. The stage was being set for the final act of the Severan drama, the violent conclusion that awaited mother and son on the banks of the Rhine. In March of 235 AD, during a campaign near Mogontiacum, which we now call Mainz, the crisis that had been building for years finally broke upon Severus Alexander and his mother with fatal force. The army had gathered to face the Germanic threat that had been troubling the Rhine frontier, and the soldiers were ready for battle, eager to test themselves against the barbarians who had been raiding Roman territory with such impunity. But Alexander still hesitated, still preferred to negotiate rather than fight, still looked to his mother for guidance when the troops expected him to lead them forward into glory. Their patience, worn thin by years of what they saw as weakness and indecision, finally gave out entirely. The mutiny began among the soldiers who had followed Maximinus Thrax, those who admired his martial bearing and his common touch, who saw in him the warrior emperor they had always wanted. They proclaimed him emperor, lifting him on their shields in the traditional gesture of military acclamation that dated back to the earliest days of the legions, cheering for a man they believed would give them what Alexander had failed to provide: victory, plunder, and an emperor who understood what it meant to be a soldier. The cry spread through the camp like fire through dry grass on a summer day. Soldiers who had grumbled privately now shouted their support openly. The officers who might have defended Alexander found themselves surrounded by hostile troops and chose silence over martyrdom, understanding that to oppose the mood of the army was to invite their own destruction. Mutinous troops, dissatisfied with Alexander's leadership and the dominance of his mother, killed both Severus Alexander and Julia Mamaea in their camp. The soldiers had lost patience with an emperor who seemed more interested in negotiation than combat, more inclined to listen to his mother than to them, more comfortable with diplomacy than with the honest violence of warfare. They struck without warning, bursting into the imperial tent where mother and son awaited news of the army's mood. There was no trial, no accusation, no opportunity for defense. Just swords in the darkness and blood on the canvas walls. Alexander was 26 or 27 years old when he died, having reigned for 13 years. He had tried to be a good emperor in the mold of the Antonines, respecting the Senate, governing justly, avoiding the excesses that had marked so many of his predecessors. But the age in which he lived demanded different virtues than those he possessed. It demanded warrior emperors who could inspire soldiers with their courage and lead armies to victory. It demanded men who understood that power in Rome flowed from the sword, not from the law book. Alexander possessed wisdom and moderation, but these qualities were not enough to save him when the swords came out. Julia Mamaea died alongside her son, killed by the same soldiers she had tried so hard to manage and appease. She had been the power behind the throne for 13 years, guiding her son through the complexities of imperial politics, making decisions in his name, protecting him from enemies both foreign and domestic. She had learned politics from her mother Julia Maesa and her aunt Julia Domna, women who had mastered the arts of influence in a world that gave women no formal power. But influence without armies is fragile, and when the soldiers turned against her son, there was nothing she could do to save him or herself. The death of Severus Alexander marked the end of the Severan dynasty, that remarkable family of Syrian-African origin that had ruled Rome for nearly 4 decades through war and peace, through scandal and reform, through the strange reign of Elagabalus and the sober administration of Alexander. From Septimius Severus, who had seized power through civil war and established his house upon the throne through force of arms, through Caracalla with his brutality and his citizenship decree, through Geta who died in his mother's arms, through Macrinus the brief usurper, through Elagabalus and his Syrian god, and finally through Alexander and his mother's careful guidance, the Severans had given the empire a continuity of sorts. They had been flawed rulers in many ways, prone to violence and excess, dependent on military force and family intrigue to maintain their position. But they had kept the empire together through difficult times, through plague and war and economic strain, and their fall opened an era of unprecedented chaos that would test Roman civilization to its limits. The murder at Mogontiacum marked the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a prolonged period of rapid imperial turnover, foreign invasions, economic collapse, and internal chaos that would bring the empire to the very brink of dissolution. The century that followed would see dozens of emperors rise and fall, each struggling to hold together a state that seemed determined to tear itself apart under the pressure of enemies without and rivals within. Some would reign for years, others for mere months or weeks, brief candles flickering and going out in the winds of violence that swept across the empire. Some would die in battle against foreign enemies who pressed from every direction, others at the hands of their own soldiers who had raised them up and then cast them down, still others by disease or accident or the simple exhaustion of trying to hold together a world that was falling apart. The stability that earlier generations had taken for granted would become a distant memory, a golden age that seemed impossibly remote. Maximinus Thrax, the giant soldier who had led the mutiny against Alexander, became the first of these crisis emperors. He was the first emperor who had risen from the common ranks of the army without any connection to the senatorial aristocracy, the first whose origins were truly humble. He ruled for 3 years before he too was murdered by his own soldiers, and the pattern continued with his successors. The purple became a death sentence as much as an honor, a terrible prize that brought power but rarely peace or security. And so the great dynasties pass into memory, leaving behind the echoes of their deeds and misdeeds that resonate still across the centuries. From Nerva through the Severans, we have traced a century and a half of Roman history, watching emperors rise from obscurity to supreme power and fall from the heights to violent deaths. We have seen the golden age of the Antonines, when peace and prosperity spread across the Mediterranean world, when philosophy sat upon the throne in the person of Marcus Aurelius, when the empire seemed destined to endure forever under wise and benevolent rulers. We have seen the gradual darkening of that golden age, the plagues that swept through cities and camps, the wars that drained blood and treasure, the succession crises that shed so much blood in the struggle for power. We have met emperors who were wise beyond their years and emperors who were foolish despite their experience, emperors who were cruel in their exercise of power, and emperors who tried to be just despite the temptations of absolute authority. We have seen mothers who shaped the fates of empires through intelligence and determination, using influence where force was denied them. We have seen soldiers who decided which rulers would live and which would die, their swords the ultimate arbiters of Roman politics. We have walked through forums and palaces, battlefields and temples, watching as one of the greatest empires in human history struggled with the challenges of its age. These were men and women who shaped the world, whose decisions affected millions of lives across 3 continents, whose names echo still across the centuries that separate their time from ours. They built roads that we still travel, created laws that influence legal systems to this day, established patterns of power that recur throughout human history whenever empires rise and fall. To understand them is to understand something essential about how power works, how it corrupts and how it sometimes ennobles, how human beings cope with the weight of supreme authority and the isolation it brings. Rest now, and let these names and stories settle into your mind like sediment at the bottom of a still, deep pool. The history of Rome continues beyond this point, through crisis and recovery, through transformation and renewal, through the slow evolution of empire into something new and strange. But for tonight we pause, we breathe, and we remember. The emperors sleep in their tombs, their ashes scattered to the winds of time, their monuments crumbling slowly into the earth from which they were raised. But their stories remain with us, passed down through generations of scholars and storytellers, preserved in ancient texts and modern histories, living on in the imagination of all who care to remember the glories and sorrows of ages past. May their tales accompany you into peaceful rest, carrying you gently toward the shores of sleep. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you some small portion of the wisdom and wonder of ages past, some echo of the grandeur that was Rome. The night deepens, the stars will slowly overhead, and the ancient world rests in the embrace of history. Sleep well, and dream perhaps of marble forums and legionary camps, of emperors and senators, of all the vanished splendor of an empire that ruled the world. The story continues, but for now let silence fall, let peace descend, and let the past release its hold upon your waking mind. Tomorrow brings its own concerns, but tonight belongs to rest, to remembrance, and to the gentle passage into dreams.